Now, there are parts of my story I will get into, but as much as I had grown up in kind of a religious home in a Methodist church, wanted to believe in that God and power of prayer, through those 20 years plus in neurosurgery, there had been more and more difficulty with me to understand how consciousness could survive death of the brain and body. And in fact, I had a decline in my faith. And in fact, I had a decline in my faith. And in fact, I had a decline in my faith over that period of time, just because I just didn't understand how our soul could survive the death of the brain and body. And that was punctuated in the year 2000 because I had a particular event in my life that had to do with a fundamental feature of my upbringing that I'll get into later on in the story. But suffice it to say for now that what happened to me in 2000 ended up putting me squarely into a very agnostic category. So I spent 8 years of my life very agnostic before my coma. And that's why it was strange that in this trip to Israel, wandering around the streets of Old Jerusalem in the pre-dawn with the birds singing and the twilight coming up in the east, I stumbled on the Via Dolorosa and was amazingly moved by the power of that walk in trying to find my hotel. That was the part that I told my family about when I came back. That's not the part that got my doctor's attention. What got their attention was they knew, as they were questioning my family about my medical history in the first 2 days after I got at the hospital, that while I was in Israel, the worst case scenario, that giant nightmare for doctors, infectious disease specialists around the world, had occurred in the Tel Aviv hospital. And it has to do with something called the Klebsiella pneumonia carbopinamase, or KPC gene, that had first surfaced in a bacterium in 1996 in North Carolina, killed that patient, but it was carefully isolated. The problem with it is that that gene confers complete antibiotic resistance on the host bacterium. And that gene surfaced again in New York in 2000, in Paris in 2001. Each time killed the patient, was carefully isolated in a hospital setting, did not get out, but the word was out there among physicians and all those who take care of infectious disease that this gene was very, very deadly. And potentially, the thinking was if it ever moved into a bacterium in a patient that was a ubiquitous bacterium, like E. coli, and got out in this world, it could create a situation that would make the Black Plague look like a picnic, because it would be so devastating, completely unresponsive to any known antibiotics, and it takes more than 10 years to develop new antibiotics. So that would be just a horrific situation. The problem is that very event had happened in that Tel Aviv hospital right around the time I was there. And so the concern was that maybe I had brought that back, because what my doctors knew is that that KPC gene had surfaced in Tel Aviv and for the first time in history had migrated into a patient's other organisms, because those bacteria are very prolific. They can trade genetic material between species. And in that case in Tel Aviv, it migrated into an E. coli. And thank God they were able to contain that. That patient died, but they were worried that I might have brought that back to the U.S. And you can bet that had them very, very frightened. Now, as the week went on and I did not respond to antibiotics, that was their big concern. Now, it turns out by day 7, things were starting to turn around finally. My white blood cell count was coming down a little bit, but the problem was I had no neurologic function left at that time. They were at a point of doing brain death criteria. That was the next step. And it had only gotten worse during the week, so in fact they held a conference that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma. They had a conference with my family where they said, well, you know, he started this week with a 10% chance of survival. Now we're down to a 2% chance of survival. And if he's in that lucky 2%, best case scenario, that he'll spend a month or 2 in this hospital, then be transferred to a nursing home in a persistent vegetative state and die in coma a few months later. So the recommendation was, why don't we stop the antibiotics? And that was indeed what they did. Now, It turns out it was a few hours after that that I started coming back to this world. And my doctors were right. I was extremely ill from this and should not have survived at all, and should not have had any experience at all, much less any memories of experience. And that's one of the reasons why my story has captivated the scientific and medical worlds by storm, is because I had an unbelievably robust, hyper-real experience that I'm going to describe to you in some detail. And it should never have happened, according to everything that we know. Now, when I did come back, my brain was wrecked. No words, no language, no recognition of any of those beings around the hospital bed. My mother, sisters, sons. Absolutely no clue what this universe was. But I knew where I'd been. I remembered completely, full well, the journey I was returning from, even though I remembered absolutely nothing during any part of it of Eben Alexander's life before coma. No words, no language, none of the religious concepts, certainly none of the knowledge of all those years spent in neurosurgery studying brain, mind, and consciousness. Every bit of that was completely deleted for this entire experience, which makes it a little bit atypical when you look at other near-death experiences. But I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander, and it took me many months to even begin to glimpse how and why that might have been the case. My default understanding early on was that, well, of course, I had this severe bacterial meningitis that destroyed the neocortex, the human part of my brain. So it made perfect sense that I didn't have any memories or knowing of my life before coma. Turns out the reasons for it go quite a bit deeper than that. But that was my working model for a long time, that such a severe neocortical destruction would erase all the memories. But it turns out that that set the stage for a very powerful journey with tremendous lessons in it. Now, what I knew full well when I came back was the entire journey. That journey started in a place that I call the earthworm's eye view. Very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm, like being underground or in dirty jello. I remember this sensation of lots of roots or blood vessels around me. And almost I can feel them just thinking about what it was like, and I could sense them way off into the distance. Although I had no body image at any point of this journey. I was just a piece of awareness experiencing all this. But in that coarse, horrible, ugly underground realm that was completely unresponsive, even though I had no words, no language, I could still wonder, what, where? But never a flicker of response to that curiosity. Now, many, when I would give these talks early on, they would say, well, was that earthworm's eye view, which is what I call that ugly underground realm where everything began, was that hell or purgatory? I would think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And this was none of that. That curiosity was never answered with any flicker of anything. In looking back on it, I think that that very coarse, primitive, murky existence was the very best consciousness my physical brain could muster when it was soaking in pus and being destroyed by this primitive E. coli infection. Now, it turns out that if you would ask me before my coma, well, if that primitive earthworm eye view is what your brain is mustering right now with this devastating infection as it progresses and melts the outer surface, the human part of your brain, what's the next step? I would have told you, well, obviously the next step is a state of no awareness at all. That is the biggest shock of the journey, is that in fact, as this all progressed, and it did seem that that earthworm eye view went on for eons, because I promise you I had no memory moment to moment of time. I had absolutely zero memory of my life before coma, not a tiniest bit. And so it did seem to go on for a very long time. The good news, it did not last forever. And what happened next was this slowly spinning white light that came towards me, a very clear and pure light that had fine white and gold tendrils off of it. And this white light came towards me, and the best part about it is it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it turns out that I had been aware of sound in that earthworm eye view, that very primitive existence. The sound was a pounding, monotonous sound, like someone smashing on an anvil over and over again. Just a steady rhythm. And was this slowly spinning white light that came towards me, a very clear and pure light that had fine white and gold tendrils off of it. And this white light came towards me, and the best part about it is it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And it turns out that I had been aware of sound in that earthworm eye view, that very primitive existence. The sound was a pounding, monotonous sound, like someone smashing on an anvil over and over again. Just a steady rhythm. And it was a very cursing sound. 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 And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. And yet, as this pure white light came towards me, it was coming with this perfect musical melody. Absolutely beautiful. And as you will hear, sound, music, vibration, frequency is the way that our souls transcend in these levels. It's one of the reasons why sound, hymns, chants have been used for thousands of years to help engender deep transcendental conscious states in any kind of spiritual broadening of consciousness, religious ceremony, etc. And that sound is absolutely essential to the work I do now. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but that melody, spinning melody as I called it, came towards me, and it opened up like a rip, and it opened up like a rip, and it opened up like a rip in that ugly earthworm eye view, and it was a rip that opened up into this brilliant, ultra-real valley. And I remember ascending up into this valley, up into this brilliant greenery, lush with life, absolutely fertile. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck. And I had no body awareness, but I was moving up through it because I was a speck on a butterfly wing. Now, this was not a butterfly like some entomologist here on Earth can give you genus and species. This was the real deal. And butterflies in that realm, just like we often have dragonflies, butterflies, and hummingbirds that are messengers from that realm, from souls of the departed loved ones. And there are thousands of stories out there. I'm sure there's some in this room about that very phenomenon. But in that realm, butterflies are far more powerful and amazing than they are in this realm. And I was a speck of awareness, and it turns out on this wing of this butterfly, this was one of millions of butterflies, and they were looping and swirling in this beautiful river of love and color and life beyond description. And I remember how we would dip down and go through that lush greenery, and there would be flowers and blossoms, buds on trees that would open up even as we flew by. I remember the rich textures and colors beyond the rainbow. And so beautiful. And in that beautiful valley, as we would come up and ascend above all that greenery, I could see that there were hundreds of souls dancing. I could see that there were hundreds of souls dancing.
Descriptively, just like a cave, but it was somewhat put into like I would say it's a club setting, but I didn't see any bars. I'm not seeing any drinking. I don't see anything like that. I just see people seem to be dancing without any music at all. No music at all. I'm not hearing any music at all, but people are almost like slow dancing as if they're just bopping their head to a tune, but there's no music playing at all. And as I'm trying to really look upon what's going on and who are these people that I'm looking at, like what's going on? Why? Because I'm still at the same height of fear. So I'm still trying to figure out how can anybody be literally enjoying their dance or whatever they're doing in this kind of environment, like in this environment. And so I look over, and then I see this young. This appeared to be the only being that was there that somewhat seemed like he recognized me. Everyone else seemed like it was a controlled force as to their bop or their slow motion, two-step, or whatever it was. He's looking at me. As he's looking at me, he has on these dark shades, and I'm trying to figure out, as I was thinking to myself, like, I'm trying to figure out what exactly is like going on with him. Because I'm thinking in my mind, obviously, again, I want to make it clear that, like, when I was there, what my thoughts were just as communicative as if you would speak. So as I would think, is how I would be able to move too. So it was like, as I would think I want to go over here to go to this part, because I'm trying to get out the cave before I had gotten to that place. I want to make a left here. I want to go here. As I would think it, boom, I would automatically just go to that place, that particular place. And it wasn't a walk. It was like a force. It was simultaneous. As I thought, then boom, it would happen. And so now back at this cave, and I'm looking at this dude, and he's like two-stepping back and forth. That's when I started to realize that he wasn't enjoying himself, that he was actually in torment. But it seemed like his torment was something that he was going through within himself, but I could not see. So even his gaze upon me was of a cry of help, but there's no communication. You understand what I'm saying? So he's not saying, help me, help me, help me, help me, or he's not able to even show me that he's suffering. It's almost like I knew it, because of the look that he was looking upon me with. That even as I'm looking, but we can't. The slightest bit of interaction is not happening. We can't interact at all whatsoever. And so I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I'm even more scared now. And I'm like, what am I doing in this place? And it was at that moment that I had thought, and it came to me that I was like, am I dead? Am I in hell? And I couldn't. That's all that was boggling over my mind, like, oh my God, I think I died. What happened? How did I get here? What am I doing here? Was the next question. It was like, what am I doing here? How did I get here? Did I die? What's going on? What's going on?
I could see that there were hundreds of souls dancing. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, as I came back to this world and was trying to record the whole experience, I described them as being dressed in peasant garb, very simple clothing, yet beautiful colors, and tremendous joy and merriment. And there were lots of children playing and dogs jumping, and it was just a wonderful festival. And it was all being fueled because up above, in the velvety black skies above, and it was all being fueled because up above, in the velvety black skies above, and it was all being fueled because up above, in the velvety black skies above, were pure spiritual beings, orbs of golden light, swooping and swirling in formation, leaving sparkling golden trails, emanating these hymns, chants, anthems, powerful like a tsunami wave, crescendo after crescendo after crescendo of the most beautiful music, waves washing through me. And that's what was fueling this incredible joy and mirth going on in this Gateway Valley, as I came to call it. Now, the important thing to understand is that Gateway Valley was much more real than this world. Far sharper, crisper, and more real than this. This is very dreamlike by comparison. That was a deep, deep mystery to me for a long time, trying to understand that ultra reality. It's very hard to put it into words. And when I would first describe that to people and talk about the ultra reality, people would say, well, is that like high-def TV? Well, it's a lot more than that. The way we know things there, you don't see with the eyes, you don't hear with the ears, you become others to feel the emotional power of existence. The way we know things there, you don't see with the eyes, you don't hear with the ears, you become others to feel the emotional power of existence. The way we know things there, you don't see with the eyes, you don't hear with the ears, you become others to feel the emotional power of existence.
And as my soul left my body, I began traveling faster than the speed of light. And I began falling and falling and falling. And all of a sudden, this explosion happened on the inside of me. It was as if there was like a sulfuric type acid burn that consumed me in every way. It was so hideous and terrifying. There are no words to describe the level of pain and the type of burn that I was experiencing.
What was it?
It was hell, Pat. It was what the
burn
Bible
was hell.
describes as hell. It was the fire of hell. And when I looked around, not only was I in a place of death, but I now had become death. I was no longer in a place where there was peace. I was in a place of total torment.
Were you terrified?
I had become fear.
Oh, you become fear.
I had become a being of fear. You know, the Bible describes that death is the absence of God.
Yeah, yeah.
And so in the absence of God, in the absence of anything good, your soul actually transforms into a being of fear, which is the opposite of love. So my being, my person turned into a being of fear, a being of pain, a being in total isolation.
There wasn't anybody else around you.
Pat, I could look out and I could see thousands, millions of people that were all around me, but I was unable to communicate with them. It was a huge sea of people.
Yes,
and there were many, many chambers that were all around me. And all of the people that were there were in the same formless being, screaming out in agony, in total terror, in a hideous scream. Then there was no end to it, Pat. There are no words to describe how horrific this was.
They were screaming in agony.
They were screaming in agony, and because they had become total beings of death.
Yeah.
And that's hard for the physical mind to understand those things. But when I would look at it, I remember looking at an individual, particularly, and they were as close to me as you are. And when I saw them, Pat, I knew everything about them. I knew every sin they had committed. I knew my knowledge about their life was completely full. I knew everything they had done wrong. I knew their thoughts. I knew their emotions. I knew the will. I knew everything I could think upon. My wisdom was in its fullness. It was like a Harvard degree instantly, you know, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter. In that hideous state of a burning torment, the only knowledge that mattered was that Jesus Christ was Lord. And here I am in this state of agony, indescribable agony, and the only thing that mattered was that I never surrendered to the lordship of Jesus Christ.
Was this like regret in your mind as part of that fear?
Absolutely regret. There was so much regret and shame and guilt that I had believed a lie and that I had believed the deceit. And when I looked out across the lake, across the heavens, I could see the entire universe, Pat. And it was like the earth was magnified. And there was a mutual feeling, a mutual understanding of everyone, the thousands and millions of people that were there with me, that we did not want anyone to go where we were. We wanted people to go back to earth and warn everyone, don't believe the lie. Do not be deceived by your enemy. Do not come here.
Is that in your mind prior to this that ever could have seen anything as horrible as that?
No, no.
Never.
And now I read the Bible and I see the Bible, how it describes hell.
Yeah.
And I look at my experience, and there are no words to describe what I experienced, Pat. You could look across the Gulf expanse, and you could see heaven. You could see the peace, the joy, the love, the wholeness. And you knew you were never going to experience that, because time does not exist in eternity. Time does not exist at all. And the only thing you can do is hope that no one else will come where you are.
It's the most horrible prospect when you think of it. I mean, human mind can't conceive of anything as absolutely awful as that.
You cannot. The human mind cannot, in our physical state, cannot understand spiritual things at all. But you know, Pat, what is so amazing is God's love was so incredible that before I actually shot myself, I cried out to God to forgive me. And in that cry of desperation of forgiveness, God heard me. And he is so faithful to his word and to his promise that in my screaming and in my agony and in the revelation of what I experienced, God came down from heaven and this hand scooped me up, Pat, and picked me up. And so when this hand picked me up and took me over the vast expanse, took me over that gulf fix, and it's huge, but to God it's just like a simple,
Well, that's
a
what
simple
Jesus
dividing
said
line.
in the parable. There's a great gulf between us fixed.
Yes.
And there was a great gulf.
A great gulf, and it was of nothingness.
Yeah.
Dark, just nothingness. And when I went over that and I entered into God's presence,
Yeah.
Pat, now you can't describe God's presence either, but it was love. And I had now left a place of death and torment and darkness. And now I had entered into a place of love and light. And I experienced God's wholeness. I experienced His grace and His mercy. And there was unity with Christ that is indescribable. My pain was gone. My torment was gone. And I was in this presence of total wholeness. And you could see the lights, the beauty of the stones and the lights reflecting in heaven. And the very sight of them was rejuvenating and just energizing.
And they
it was
were communicating
magnificent.
with each other. The people were talking.
Oh yes,
walking
they were all communicating. However, I was restricted.
You were.
I was not allowed to take part in any of that. Although I knew that was going on and although I saw those things, I was not allowed to take part of that or to see many things in detail. There was many things understood, and the knowledge was free and wisdom was free. And so as I traveled over the heavens and I was cleansed of my sin, and I came back, and you know, there are, in the spiritual world, you're not confounded to the restrictions of the physical world. And so I came right back into the roof of my home, and they laid my body, the vessel of God laid my body back, my soul back into my body. And when He did that, I instantly could see and hear again. And I knew at that moment that I was surrendering to the Lordship of Jesus Christ.
In fact, often if you get into the near-death experience literature, you read a lot about the tens of thousands of life reviews that people describe. You know that old saying, your life flashes before your eyes? Well, it's very true, and that's what near-death experiencers tell you, is that you go through every bit of your life, all the crucial parts that are there to teach you about the lessons of good and bad, that are still residual lessons for you to learn, to help you and your higher soul and your soulmates, your soul group. And the judgment is not by any higher power, it's by our higher soul. That's what's doing the judging in that realm. And that's when we go through those life reviews, it's not some vague sepia-tinted memory. These are sharp, clear, crisp, absolute reliving the events more powerfully than when we live through them in the earthly realm. And we have to feel the power of our decisions, the emotional impact on our fellow beings. So if we lived a life handing out pain and suffering to others, we have to feel that in that life review. But we have to feel it far more sharply than they felt it here in the material realm, which is a pale, dim reflection of that far more real and crisp world of that gateway realm, of the realm between lives, where we reunite with our higher souls and where we reunite with our soul mates. And in the glaring, beautiful, all-loving light of that infinitely powerful God, that is the setting in which we relive those events and then plan our next incarnations for coming back in. The realm between lives, where we reunite with our higher souls and where we reunite with our soul mates. And in the glaring, beautiful, all-loving light of that infinitely powerful God, that is the setting in which we relive those events and then plan our next incarnations for coming back in. But it is a very crisp ultra-reality. This is all about those lessons that we're here to learn. And the coin of that realm is love. That unconditional love that goes far beyond the phrase, far beyond those words. And the coin of that realm is love. That unconditional love that goes far beyond the phrase, far beyond those words. And of course, so many who have had near-death experiences and shared death experiences and other similarly spiritually transformative experiences know exactly what that's all about, that unconditional love. And the reason it's so important for all of us to get is because we're here in soul school to learn those lessons of that love. And what we find is that that unconditional love has infinite power to heal. And I came from my journey to see that the hardships and difficulties in this life, and I promise you as a neurosurgeon, as a doctor, that very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. That very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. That very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. That very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. That very much includes illness and injury. They are gifts. They are opportunity for growth of our souls. We are all here as members of soul groups to do this growing. And when I talk about soul mates, I'm not just talking about that love of your life. I also came to see that often those who I'd seen before my coma as my nemesis, as someone who was in my way, preventing me from getting something I wanted in this life, often is a very near and dear soul mate. And I came to see the power of that love, that unconditional love, to heal. It heals the individual, it heals the soul group, it heals all of humanity, it heals life all around this world, and it heals consciousness throughout this universe, because there are many sentient beings in many civilizations throughout all of eternity, throughout this universe. This is a much bigger party than I might have ever thought before. And this is all part of our joining that much bigger awareness and knowing of consciousness in its grandest sense. Now, it turns out that in that beautiful Gateway Valley, that ultra-real valley on that beautiful butterfly wing, the best part about it, I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful girl, and I promise you it doesn't get better than that. There was a beautiful girl, and I promise you it doesn't get better than that. There was a beautiful girl, and I promise you it doesn't get better than that. There was a beautiful girl, and I promise you it doesn't get better than that. And it turns out, I'll never forget the way she was sitting, the way she was dressed, the way she looked at me. And she looked at me with this very loving smile that transcends any of our words of love and our uses of romantic love or the love of parent and child, of any of the kind of love that we have here, love for all of humanity. This is the love that transcends it all, is that unconditional love that we encounter there. People who have near-death experiences, even if all they do is touch briefly, glimpse that unconditional love, it changes their life forever. So don't let the simplicity of that phrase lead you astray. It is infinitely powerful. It's something that we all know, because all of our souls have been there before and go back, and we cycle through again and again in our ascent. Now, another thing that's very important to understand is that time flow in that gateway realm is very different from time flow here. That's one of the reasons why those life reviews, the memories are not just vague memories, but very strong, powerful learning opportunities where the goods and bads of our life and what we've done to others, feeling the impact of our decisions on others, is so hyper real. And we go through it, like they say, flashes before your eyes. And the amazing thing is it doesn't take anything of Earth time. It could happen in a second, or it could take a century to unfold. It doesn't matter, because time flow and causality in that realm is a much higher order than in this realm. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried. And that's why often when I talk about reincarnation, some people get a little worried. And they, wait a minute, what if the love of my life gets tired of waiting for me and they reincarnate before I get there? I promise you that doesn't happen. Because this is really all about love, and it's all about the relationships that we have. This is all about learning in soul school and growing as we do. And there's nothing more complex than knowing that it's simply by following a pathway that is one of manifesting that love as best we can. Love is the coin of that realm. And the more we can serve as conduits of that love, because our very consciousness is a direct, absolute connection to the divine, infinite healing power of that all-loving source. And by serving as conduits for that and allowing the love to come through us to our fellow beings, to show compassion, forgiveness, mercy, acceptance, because our very consciousness is a direct, absolute connection to the divine, infinite healing power of that all-loving source. And by serving as conduits for that and allowing the love to come through us to our fellow beings, to show compassion, forgiveness, mercy, acceptance, that's all that matters. And that's what these lessons are all about. And that's how our souls ascend, is by getting closer and closer to that perfection of that love and ascending towards that oneness with the divine. Now, it turns out that this beautiful girl on the butterfly wing, as I said, she never said a word. She didn't have to. Her thoughts came straight into my awareness. Now, of course, I had no words or language, so it was pure conceptual flow. But when I wrote it all up a few weeks later, when I came back to this world, I put those thoughts down that had come to me directly from her with that all-loving smile. And this is, in my view, the central message of Proof of Heaven. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of. And nothing to fear is very, very critical, because I saw very much, in my view, how this was not a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. How this was not a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. How this was not a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. How this was not a battle between good and evil, between light and darkness. In fact, there's plenty of evil and darkness in this world, but it's not a force that is against love and light of that infinitely powerful Creator. In fact, there's plenty of evil and darkness in this world, but it's not a force that is against love and light of that infinitely powerful Creator. We simply serve as channels to bring that love and light into this world, and it displaces the darkness and evil. The darkness and evil are plenty real in this material realm, and you can also encounter them in those lower spiritual realms, such as I did in that earthworm eye view. The important thing to remember is when you know and fully know that you are a divine, eternal, spiritual being directly connected to that all-powerful creative deity, you have nothing to fear. And that is all you need to know. All you need to know. All you need to know. When you believe that and know that, it enables you to bring that lightness and love into this world in the face of darkness and evil as we perceive it here, and to do so in those spiritual realms and ascend higher and higher towards that oneness with the divine, with the soul group, and all that our souls are doing to ascend to those levels. Now, it turns out that there was another message that she gave me in addition to these messages of unconditional love. And this is one, in retrospect, I wish I had embellished on a little more in the book. You can do no wrong. 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 And of course, I get in a little bit of hot water over that one when people just get to the book and read that far and they go, wait a minute, we can do wrong down here. Well, the reality is she meant it. You can do no wrong, as long as we realize that we reap what we sow. If we hand out pain and suffering to others as part of the lessons we're trying to learn, we're going to end up either making amends in this incarnation or having to live through the pain and suffering on their behalf in that life review. There is no need for an eternal hell. 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 And in fact, that life review provides plenty of impetus for us to learn the lessons of that love and then plan that next incarnation with our soulmates and come back in here. But you can do no wrong, knowing full well that we are here to learn and teach those lessons with our soulmates. And again, the lessons have everything to do with that love, have to do with knowing that we are eternal spiritual beings through multiple incarnations. And for those of you who grew up like I did in a Christian faith, I promise you there's a tremendous amount in original Christianity that fully supports reincarnation. And I, believing as I did before my coma that brain creates consciousness, I'd never paid any attention to the near-death experience literature. I also did not realize that there's a very strong scientific literature on past life memories in children. In fact, the arch skeptic and scientist Carl Sagan admitted that one of the features of what he called psi or paranormal phenomena that had way too much evidence and demanded a much deeper explanation was past life memories in children and the evidence that it brings for reincarnation. A lot of that work has been done by the group at University of Virginia, and Karen Newell and I work a lot with that group now, and some of the work we do with sacred acoustics. But it turns out that the work of Ian Stevenson and more recently of Jim Tucker about past life memories in children fully brings out the reality of that. That reincarnation is real. Then you have to go and explain, well, how in the world does that happen? It clearly defies that simplistic kindergarten level thinking of brain creates consciousness. So you can bet there's some major pushback from neuroscientists who are materialists in their beliefs. But in fact, it's very real. And this is a big part of understanding. It's also very consistent, as I said, with early Christianity, with the original teachings, especially if you start to get into the Gnostic Gospels. And there are also reasons why, even though it is mentioned that John the Baptist was a reincarnation of Elijah the prophet, it has not been brought out as much in the New Testament, but in some of the other Gnostic Gospels and other early sources, it's a very profound reality. And yet there are reasons why that whole concept of reincarnation was kind of squashed by the Council of Nicaea and by others who were trying to control people's minds over the millennia. Now, it turns out that on that beautiful butterfly wing with this lovely girl, there was yet more to come, and that had to do with those angelic choirs above. I've told you music, sound, vibration, frequency, that's what allows our souls to ascend and transcend to higher and higher levels in those spiritual realms. And what I remember is all of that collapsing down. The material world, this four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. That deeper time of causality in that gateway, that beautiful galley, the gateway valley, where we often are between lives, collapsing down, that higher causality, all of that collapsing down until I finally emerged into this realm that I call the core. Infinite, inky blackness. Realm that I call the core. Infinite, inky blackness. Realm that I call the core. Infinite, inky blackness, filled to overflowing with infinite unconditional love of that creator, all through eternity and infinity and higher dimensional space. And in that beautiful, all-powerful, infinite love, there was also this brilliant orb of light, brighter than 1,000,000 stars, that I remember being there and I thought that it was somehow serving as an interpreter or translator. A very strong sense of the three of us being there, of that infinite, all-loving, creative power, far beyond any naming, far beyond any description. And yes, that deity has no gender. Oprah asked that question. Yes, that deity has no gender. Oprah asked that question. Yes, that deity has no gender. Oprah asked that question, just in case that one's out there. No, that deity has no gender, is completely beyond any words or description. And that's why I think that orb of light was there. Now, all of what I'd seen collapsing down, higher dimensional space-time, those spiritual realms, every bit of that was like this very complex oversphere that was there as part of the lessons. And when I entered that core realm, I was told, now not in words, this is pure conceptual flow, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. You're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. You're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things. You'll be going back. And I hope you understand by now that when I say the three of us, you know, this infinite, all-powerful creative source and that orb of light and my conscious awareness. This was consciousness far beyond the limited consciousness of Eben Alexander. This was the consciousness we all share, far deeper, far more profound, a direct link to divine, which is in each and every one of us. And you don't have to have a near-death experience to come to know this. Deep meditation and centering prayer, that's why I do so much of the work with sacred acoustics, is to help take that to the next level and help people to meditate in a much deeper fashion, because that is how we can come to know these much deeper truths. Now, it turns out that in the midst of so many lessons there in that core realm, I would then inexplicably pop back into that earthworm eye view. That was a real shocker. How in the world did that happen? I'd go right back to square one, to that very primitive, ugly underground with the roots and blood vessels around me. But I very quickly came to realize that by remembering the musical notes of the melody, and I would go through those notes in my mind and go through them like a chant, and by going through those musical notes, that spinning white light would come back and would come towards me and would open again like a rip in that fabric, and I'd re-enter that beautiful Gateway Valley on the butterfly wing with that lovely girl and all the souls dancing below, all the joy and merriment, and the same reassurance of unconditional love from her every time. And then those beautiful swooping orbs of light above, which I came to call in my writings angelic choirs. It was clear that's exactly what they were. And yet, once again, that music from those swooping orbs would generate this portal, and I would go swirling on up through higher and higher as all this collapsed down, back into that core realm, always assured you're not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things. And I cycled through several times. I don't know how many. But then there came a time, I'd even come to believe that back was back to the earthworm eye view. So, no worry. I knew that all I had to do was remember the notes of the spinning melody. And that was my ticket back up into that beautiful, ultra-real Gateway Valley, and then through the angelic choirs to higher and higher realms and back into the core. But as you can imagine, they weren't kidding. And so there came a time when the notes of the melody no longer worked. I could no longer conjure up that beautiful, spinning, pure light that had been my gateway, my portal up into that gateway realm. And to say I was sad is an understatement. Because, in fact, when those gates to heaven were closed, sadness there, emotions are extremely powerful in that realm. To imagine monsoon rains throughout all of eternity, you can begin to touch on it. But in fact, I also knew by that point that I could trust. I would be taken care of, that I could do nothing wrong, that I was infinitely loved by that all-powerful deity, beyond all description. And in that core realm, I remember the one thing I brought back that I could really bring back to this world was the sound that I heard there. I've told you how sound and vibration are so important in all of this. Well, in that core realm with that infinite inky blackness, that all-loving, all-powerful deity beyond any naming, I heard that sound of Om, that eternal resonance of all of infinity and eternity. That deep Om sound was what I called that deity when I came back. Because to me, when I was writing this all up a few weeks after my coma, the word God was way too puny a little human word. And I realized that that deity was far beyond any kind of naming or description. That's why, for me, the word Om had no baggage at all. I'd never heard of its use as a mantra in some of the Eastern meditative traditions and that kind of thing. So Om is what I call that deity. Om made perfect sense to me. And it was only much later that I came to realize, people alerted me, that Om actually was a sound that had a lot to do with other religious and spiritual traditions. Now, in this, when I was locked out, when I found that the melody, remembering the notes of the melody no longer worked to get me into that beautiful idyllic realm, As I said, I was very sad, but I knew I could trust I would be taken care of. And I remember at that point seeing thousands of beings around me in this very kind of misty, murky existence going all around me, these beings. And they were all kneeling, some with hoods, many with candles. Seeing thousands of beings around me in this very kind of misty, murky existence going all around me, these beings. And they were all kneeling, some with hoods, many with candles. And there was this murmuring energy coming up from them. And the thing that was so shocking is that murmuring energy brought the very same all-loving feeling that I'd come to know in the gateway realm and in the core with that unconditional love of the Creator. And I remember how comforting that was, and all these beings going off around me. And I remember when I wrote all that up a few weeks later, I said what those beings were doing was praying. I said what those beings were doing was praying. I said what those beings were doing was praying. I said what those beings were doing was praying. That's what I was feeling, was the power of that prayer, and how prayer can actually bring the power of that realm right into this realm. That's what I was feeling, was the power of that prayer, and how prayer can actually bring the power of that realm right into this realm. That's what I was feeling, was the power of that prayer, and how prayer can actually bring the power of that realm right into this realm and can help in our healing, especially when we come to realize that we are eternal spiritual beings, and if we can learn the lessons that the illness or injury is here to teach us, that sometimes there's a way that we are meant to recover from that illness. And that is, of course, the deeper lesson of my healing, because I spent several years completely mystified. My doctors to this day will tell you they have no explanation whatsoever for how I had a complete recovery within about 3 months, when they were basically certain I had no chance of recovery at all, other than surviving for a few months and then dying. And for those who want to hear more about that, I often steer people to that beautiful book that helped me to start glimpsing how this healing can happen. It's a book by Anita Moorjani. It's called Dying to Be Me. A very powerful book, and she had a stage 4B non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and by all accounts should have been dead within hours of hitting an emergency room in Hong Kong back in 2006. And yet she had a profound near-death experience, and when she made a decision to come back, she knew that her cancer would disappear, and that's exactly what happened. And it was reading her book that I first started to glimpse some of what is at the core of the lesson here about healing, and how we can sometimes manifest physical healing in this incarnation. So it turns out, though, that in that realm, all these beings around me, I saw the power of that prayer. I could feel the love and energy of that, and how that was coming to comfort my return, and I didn't know where I was returning to. Now, I then saw 6 faces. And the 6 faces are very important. They would kind of bubble up out of the muck around me, and they would say some words, and then they would disappear again. Now, I didn't understand any of the words. My brain was very wrecked, and I just didn't understand. It was a lot like if you've seen Charlie Brown's Christmas Story, when the adults talk, wah, 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 wah. It was the same kind of thing. And I remember seeing them, but the faces, I mean, I can remember to this day exactly what they looked like and how they kind of wiggled around. And it turns out within a few hours of waking up from coma, I was able to identify them all. But I had no idea who they were when I was in coma and first experienced them. Now, they were very important. 5 of them were physically there when I was in the last 18 hours of my coma experience before I started waking up. And that was very important because, in fact, that happened at the very far end of a journey that seemed to have gone on for months or even years. And yet it had to fit within 7 Earth days. But that's important because later on, when I was trying to explain all this, and my original default was this had to be some crazy brain effect, some wild hallucination or drug effect or dream. That's what I was trying to explain it as, but that's why the meningitis was such a gift. As we went deeper and deeper into trying to explain it, and I went over this with my doctors, went over all my scans and medical records, we came to realize, well, it seemed way too real to be real. as I described it to my older son, Eben the fourth, who was majoring in neuroscience at the time. When he came home from school 2 days after I got out of the hospital, I told him it was way too real to be real, because it was. And to me, that meant it had to be a trick of the dying brain. But after many, many months and going over all this with my doctors and everything, we came to realize, well, it was way too real to be real because it really happened. But it didn't happen in my brain, and it didn't happen in the physical universe. It was a much deeper clue about the nature of all existence, and in many ways confirmed tens of thousands of other near-death experiences and other spiritually transformative experiences, not to mention the writings of religious mystics and prophets and those writing about the afterlife going back thousands of years, because we're all talking about the same thing. It's much more real than this world. Now, it turns out that those 5 faces, as I said, 5 of them were there the last 18 hours I was in coma. That's important. There were also many people, family and friends, who were in the ICU room days before that I don't remember at all. And also, there was another face, that of Susan Renches, who was a friend of our family's, who was never physically there. And the reason she's important, she wrote a book called Third Eye Open. 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 She was a friend of our family's, of my former wife in particular, going back for decades. And Susan channeled to people, and she had written a book about healing people, including a lot of people in coma. And I remember my family had called Susan up and solicited her help. My family had called Susan up and solicited her help. My family had called Susan up and solicited her help. My family had called Susan up and solicited her help on the 4th and 5th nights of my coma. And I remember her face as clearly as if she'd been there in the ICU room like the others, although she was never within about 150 miles of that ICU room. But when I was told that in the hours after I was waking up, as all of this was starting to come back to me, and my earthly memories were starting to come back, and I was told, well, Susan was never here, but she channeled to you on nights 4 and 5 of coma, I thought, so what? Of course she did. I knew in that realm you don't go there physically anyway. But she was very real. Now, it turns out it was the 6th face, though, that really got my attention. In so many parts of this journey, being amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander, not remembering a thing about this earth, this universe, about humanity, etc. It was a real gift. It allowed for a very far journey. It allowed me to be fearless. I had no attachments. I had no memory of any kind of responsibility to any other soul. In fact, for many parts of the journey, I thought, well, this can all continue, or it can cease to continue. It does not matter. And that's why the 6th face really got my attention. It was the face of a 10-year-old boy. Turns out, as I determined later on, it was the face of Bond, my 10-year-old son. That was Sunday morning. He had just been outside the room where they had the conference with the doctors telling my family, well, we're down to a 2% chance of survival. And best case scenario is he'll spend a few months in a coma, get transferred to a nursing home, and then die. So why don't we just stop the antibiotics? They had tried to protect Bond from the worst news during this week, but he had stuck around outside the room during that discussion. He overheard that. He knew it was very bad news indeed. So he went running down the hall of the ICU and came into my room, and there I was on my ventilator and with my eyes taped shut and being ventilated 12 times a minute, as I had been for the last 7 days. And he pulled open my eyelids. And what he saw was one eye looking up there, one eye down there, both pupils blown. Those of you in medicine know that's not a good thing. And I promise you, I didn't hear him with my ears and I didn't see him with my eyes. But it got through. And he was pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. And somehow that reached all the way through. I was deep in that realm of that misty murkiness with those where the 6 faces had materialized. His was the 6th, and it broke through. And believe me, it got my attention. And it was the most terrifying moment of the entire journey, because I'd come to believe I had no responsibilities, no attachments. And now it was my love for him, even though I had no idea who this being was. But I knew that there was a very powerful, strong, loving connection that I had to come back. And it's the toughest thing I've ever done in all of my existence, was to struggle my way back to this world. I remember at times thinking it was absolutely impossible. And yet, it was impossible not to. I had to come back because of my love for this other soul. And that's when I did start waking up and come back to this world. Now, of course, as I told you earlier, my doctors were right. My brain was wrecked. When I first came back, all I remembered was the journey I had been on. And I knew that very clearly, every bit of it. And words and language came back very quickly, within hours, a day. And then childhood memories, that kind of thing, came back over a week or so. Two of my sisters would camp out on little cots beside me in the ICU and then the neuro step-down unit. And I didn't sleep at all. I was really nuts. I had a psychotic, delusional nightmare. I know what that looks like. That is nothing like that crisp ultra-reality deep inside of coma. That was not a hallucination or a dream or a drug effect, because my neocortex was far too wrecked to support such a thing. It was far more real, as I said, than anything that even my intact brain today could begin to muster. And therein lies the deep mystery that drove me to try and get an understanding of this. Now, it turns out that my childhood memories, as I said, came back over 2 weeks, 3 weeks after that. And then all of that knowing and experience of more than 20 years spent in academic neurosurgery returned to me over about 8 weeks. In fact, what I came to realize over the next several years is that memories that came back to me were more complete by 8 weeks out than they had been before my coma. That's a very mysterious and difficult thing to explain, and it only emerged that that was the case over several years after the coma. And therein lies a pretty deep clue about what's going on here. And it has to do with the very phenomenon of experience, consciousness, memory, and where all that really lives, and the reality of soul, spirit, consciousnness that then generates all of what we see unfolding in the material realm. The reason that so much of the medical community, as I said, has taken my story very seriously and often asked me to come give talks and presentations about consciousness has to do with the fact that meningitis is the most perfect model for human death. By destroying that outer neocortex, the surface of the brain, that's the part that modern neuroscience would tell you is very responsible for any of the detailed conscious experience that any of us have as human beings. Even though the phenomenon of consciousness has parts of the deeper brain that fuel it, any of the detailed awareness of consciousness, everything we see and hear, everything we think, all of our words and language, everything you ever have experienced since before you were born, according to modern neuroscience, depends on at least some part of that neocortex, the most complex calculator in the brain, that some part of it needs to be around. And my doctors knew full well from my neurologic exams, from the lab tests, and especially from really from my neurologic function and from the nature of my disease, but also from the scans that showed full thickness destruction of the neocortex over all 8 lobes of my brain. There was no way to explain this as a brain-based phenomenon, even though I tried to do that. And early on, I would tell my doctors something of what I experienced, and they would pat me on the back and say, "Oh, well, you were very, very sick. Your brain was soaking in pus. We have no idea how you've even come back to us. But all those memories, you can forget about it. The dying brain does all kinds of tricks." We tend to believe our doctors. I believe my doctors. So it was only many weeks later, as I started getting into my medical records and discussing it with them, all those neurologic exams and the various scans, and we started realizing, well, where did this happen? How did this happen? I knew that it had not happened when I came out of coma or when I went into coma. The question was, when and how did it all happen? And that became a very deep mystery to me indeed, and drove me very much into questioning everything I ever thought I had known about the nature of brain, mind, consciousness, and of all existence and reality. It turns out that this kind of disembodied consciousness, or consciousness that's actually much richer when freed up from the shackles of the physical brain, gets us back to the mind-body discussion that, as I said earlier, has been going on for more than 26 centuries. And you can see the names there of some of the luminaries over time that have discussed this: Plato and Aristotle, of course, René Descartes, and others. But it's really something that I had to question very deeply in trying to come to some kind of an understanding of this. I know that I was driven deeply into what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is something I really didn't know anything about before, even though I think the hard problem is one of the most vexing conundrum known to all of human thought. And it also got me deeply into trying to investigate the very nature of the enigma of quantum mechanics. That's right at the core of this. As you get down and scratch the surface of physical reality and try and uncover how space, time, mass, energy work, what we reveal is that consciousness is at the very core of every bit of it. You cannot separate consciousness away and pretend that the observer is observing things and that the observations are independent of that observing mind. It's called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And in fact, this is one of my favorite quotes along those lines, Sir James Jeans, who was deeply into that mystery of the enigma of quantum mechanics. And he said this in the mid-1940s: "The universe begins to look much more like a great thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather to hail it as the creator and governor of this realm." And the mysteries of those experimental results in quantum mechanics have only gotten more and more bizarre. It's not as if modern physics understands it, not as if they're smarter, although some of them will try and pretend that. That only shows they just don't get it. This is a far deeper mystery. Now, I mentioned earlier that you don't have to die or almost die to get this. In fact, by being a conscious being, the clues are deep within each and every one of us. And often it comes to us as what I call the gift of desperation. I'm sure there are many in this room who know exactly what that means. When a loved one has a terminal diagnosis or has died, or when we have a terminal diagnosis and are facing our mortality, often that's when we feel that touch and know and hear that voice of that all-loving deity that is right there to protect us and take care of us. But you can also get it through deep meditation and centering prayer. But you can also get it through deep meditation and centering prayer. But you can also get it through deep meditation and centering prayer. But you can also get it through deep meditation and centering prayer. And it was about 2 years after my coma that I first started getting deeply into realizing that any kind of exploration of consciousness, and I realized I had to go deep within my own consciousness to even begin to glimpse some of the lessons that I needed to learn to understand my journey. And that's when I was exposed to a discussion about brain entrainment through sound, using differential sound frequencies, brain entrainment through sound, using differential sound frequencies, brain entrainment through sound, using differential sound frequencies, brain entrainment through sound, using differential sound frequencies. And it's something I don't really have time to get into in any detail tonight. I talked about it briefly at the end of Proof of Heaven, especially in reference to the work of Robert Monroe and the Monroe Institute and some of what he did with brain entrainment. And since then, I've come to encounter Karen Newell, who is here on the front row, and she is a business partner with Kevin Cossey, and they together have developed Sacred Acoustics, which really takes that kind of brain entrainment using differential sound frequencies to a whole new level. So any of you out there who want to learn more about that, I would encourage you to visit sacredacoustics.com and start learning. I work with them on a daily and nightly basis in terms of trying to help evolve these meditative techniques and tools to help kind of the rest of us get deeply into meditation. I've gotten into a pattern where I try to meditate 2 or 3 hours a day, although realistically, if I can get an hour a day, I'm usually pretty lucky. And it's something that makes a tremendous difference as time goes on, year after year, in my knowing and understanding. I've revisited those realms of my journey. And in fact, not just revisiting memories, but revisiting the beings, the lessons, the spiritual power. But revisiting the beings, the lessons, the spiritual power. But revisiting the beings, the lessons, the spiritual power. But revisiting the beings, the lessons, the spiritual power, through using these tools of deep meditation with sacred acoustics. But it really is something one has to do as a lifelong commitment. It's not as if you can just kind of do this a few times and then say, well, it didn't really work for me. It's really something that's a lifelong commitment, but believe me, it's very much worth it, because inside of our consciousness is infinite knowing and capability, and all of consciousness. In fact, the entire universe is a hologram, and the mind is a hologram, and in fact, they are identical holograms. And that is exactly what some of this meditative technique can enable any of us to get deeply into. So it's something I highly recommend. Now, another thing that comes up is I came to realize in the study of my journey, as I said, the hard problem of consciousness, which basically, in its simplest form, is that no neuroscientist on earth can give you the first sentence, not even a sentence, to explain how the physical brain might create consciousness. And it's not because we haven't done enough research. You know, the 1990s were the decade of the brain, and Obama has recently earmarked a significant amount of federal funding to additional study of the brain. The more we study the brain, as many brain scientists and those interested in philosophy of mind and the deepest aspects of neuroscience and of physics have come to realize, the more we realize it does not create consciousness. A better way to look at it is the brain is a reducing valve or filter. And that's an old idea. The filter theory is one name for that. In the late 19th century, the likes of Carl Jung, Frederick Meyer, Sir James Jeans, they were deeply into studying human psyche and the mysteries of consciousness and the filter theory. And they realized that there are many facets of human personality that do not end with bodily death. And they knew the power of reincarnation. They had the evidence of it. And it turns out all of that got sidetracked in 1905. And that had to do with the annus mirabilis of Albert Einstein. That's basically his 4 papers that year are what kicked off the heyday of scientific materialism of the 20th century. But the good news is the paper that actually also kicked off the whole field of quantum mechanics, his paper on the photoelectron effect, that's what gave him the Nobel Prize, also sowed the seeds for the undoing of that pure materialism. And that's all coming together now as modern students of consciousness, those who study the deep mysteries of mind, of the very nature of existence, of the physics of the quantum world, and in trying to put that together with a deeper understanding of space, time, and causality, how everything really works, are coming to realize that consciousness is at the very core of it all. That consciousness is at the very core of it all. That consciousness is at the very core of it all. That consciousness is at the very core of it all. I wanted to dive deeply into everything I could read about near-death experiences. I was completely blown away by what had happened to me. I wanted to learn everything I could about what others had been through. And the more he advised me to write down everything, which I did. I wrote 20,000 words of my entire coma experience before I finally dove into the near-death experience literature. And as I did, I was absolutely shocked. I came to realize that tens of thousands of reports are out there. And in fact, by extension, hundreds of millions have been to this very same realm. And in fact, the near-death experience literature started growing largely out of the 1960s when medical science came up with ways to bring back cardiac arrest patients. And that's what has populated this world with millions of souls who have been to the other side and come back to tell the tale. That is not an accident. That is all happening for a purpose. Now, in fact, the more I read about the near-death literature, I then got into the afterlife literature going back thousands of years, including the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Greek writings on the afterlife. And I came to realize that and the writings of religious mystics and prophets, that they're all talking about the same thing. Skeptics kind of bang their head against the forest, in the trees, and miss the forest of the reality of that realm. more than half of people who report on near-death experiences talk about the ultra-reality of that realm. It changes their lives. Another interesting thing is the memories do not fade. Often after I give a talk like this, I'll have people come up to me, including people who may have had a profound near-death experience that they remember very vividly, even though it occurred in the 1920s, 1930s. They remember it to this day. These memories don't fade. They are not brain-based memories. They are not hallucinations, drug effect, dream states. This is reality. It's at the core of who we are and what's going on. Now, I started encountering deeper mysteries about my own journey. As I told you, I was amnesic for Eben Alexander's life before coma as I went through all this. And that part is quite atypical for a near-death experience. And of course, I originally attributed that to the severe meningitis, destruction of my neocortex. To me, that explained why I didn't remember my life. I know now the explanation goes far deeper than that. But it turns out that months after my coma, I was really wrestling with things as I read more and more near-death experiences. One is, if I had scripted this, first and foremost, my father would have been there. He had passed over 4 years before my coma. This is the father I mentioned to you earlier, combat surgeon in the Second World War, who was a tremendous influence on me, a scientist, and a very strong religious and spiritual influence. And yet, he was nowhere to be found. And similarly, in my view, as I read more and more of this, was the deep mystery on that butterfly wing, that beautiful girl. I'll never forget how she was dressed, how she was sitting, how she looked at me, the way her thoughts came in, "You're deeply loved and cherished," all those wonderful messages of unconditional love. I remember her face so perfectly that when I came back, I realized I'd never met her in my life. That was a really deep mystery. And to me, the more I read about near-death experiences, the more I realized how the similarities far outweigh the differences, how my experience very much validated tens of thousands of reports out there of other near-death experiences and of the afterlife literature and of prophets and mystics in their writings going back thousands of years. And yet, who in the world was this beautiful girl? And I was really shocked because I knew I'd been on a profound, very real spiritual journey. Yet why these strange curveballs that my father wasn't there and this beautiful girl who I'd never met? And to answer that question of the shock that hit me, this is the spoiler alert, because this is pretty much how the book kind of comes together. Turns out that 4 months after my coma, I got an answer to all this. And to give you that answer, I have to go back a little bit and give you more of my personal history. Part of my story that was absolutely essential, and that for much of my life was something that didn't make much sense to me, is the fact that I was adopted. My birth mother was a sophomore in high school. My birth father was a senior in high school. And there was really no way for them to get together. And as my birth mother found out to her chagrin over several months, as much as she wanted to keep me, her own father was unemployed, he couldn't hold a job, she had 2 younger sisters at home. As a 10th grader, there was no way for her to bring a baby into that house. North Carolina had very strict laws and about adoption and all that. And so, in fact, she, by 4 months out, figured that she had to put me up for adoption. The handwriting was on the wall. So she had to let me go. Now, it turns out that, like many adoptees, I would wonder about my birth family, and I would sometimes write letters to the children's home as I was growing up, wondering, is there any sign of my birth mother out there? And those strict North Carolina laws were there to prevent any kind of reunion. In fact, I heard of examples where birth dates were changed just to make it more difficult for anyone to find their origins. And turns out I couldn't have been more fortunate. I was adopted into a very loving family that honored all my hopes and dreams, and I couldn't have been luckier. So I'd let it go. I'd learned, okay, people made agreements back in 1954, and they were just living by those agreements, and that's fine. I let it go. Turns out, as so many things in our lives, there are those things that make no sense for the longest time until we look back and see how maybe it was all part of a much deeper lesson, especially some of those hardships and difficulties. And likewise, there's some events that seem very trivial when they first happen, and yet they have tremendous magnitude. One of those events has to do with the fact that my older son, Eben the fourth, I've already told you about him, he was the one majoring in neuroscience in college when I was in coma. Well, in the year 2000, he'd been in 6th grade, and he came home with a school project, and that was on family genealogy. And I remember he came to me and told me about that project, and I told him a few stories about our adoptive family history, and he said, "Dad, you just don't get it. This is about your biological heritage. We need to know more about your adoptive family, about your birth family." And I remember just thinking, okay, gosh, I'll humor him. And so I wrote another letter to the another letter to the children's home in the year 2000. And I remember it was a Friday afternoon during a blizzard. I was taking Eben. We lived in Boston. I was working at Harvard Medical School at the time. And I was driving Eben up to Maine to go skiing. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, Betty, the social worker, said if I call her today, maybe she'd have an answer. I fully expected to get the same answer I'd always gotten, no, your birth mother's not out there, forget about it. I called her up, and she said, why, yes, I did find something out. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving through a blizzard, but I was sitting down. Your birth parents got married. I cannot tell you what a shock that was. Never had that thought crossed my mind that they might have gotten together. And Betty said, there's more. At which point I did pull over to the side of the road. And she said, they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. And they're still grieving her loss. So it's not a good time to come back in their lives. That was that trauma I told you about in February 2000 that sent me into 8 years of pure agnosticism. I didn't recognize what a hit that perceived rejection was at that time. It was only months later when people started pointing out to me that I'd stopped taking my 2 sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. And I came to realize that the biggest casualty of that perceived rejection was it wiped out any last hope that there was a loving personal God or any power to prayer. And that was gone from my life for 8 years. I promise you my coma journey changed all of that forever. Well, it turns out that 7 years after that, in the summer of 2007, walking on a beach in South Carolina with 2 of my sisters, they said, well, don't you think it's about time you reached out to your birth family again? My first thought, no, because I recognized at that time how that perceived rejection in February 2000 had really kicked me over the cliff. My whole life had started to spiral downhill, and it took me a long time to figure out what had happened and to try and reverse that flow and come back to this, into existence and be there for my family and friends. But it turns out that they were right, and it was time. So I wrote another letter. This was in summer 2007. To the children's home, and this time got a very positive answer. Yes, we'd love to meet you. All of this is described in detail in the book Proof of Heaven, so you can get a lot more background there. And it's a beautiful story, a wonderful reunion. Turns out October 5th, 2007, I walked down a sidewalk in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and for the first time in 54 years, I was with my birth parents. And it was the most beautiful reunion. I cannot put in words. That old saying, walking on air, is exactly how I felt. And if you'd asked me soon thereafter, how long did it take you to walk down that short sidewalk to their front door? 10 seconds or 10 minutes? I couldn't have told you. I was so completely blown away. And then meeting them and reconnecting after all those years apart. A beautiful story. The next day, I met my birth sister and brother, and in the coming months, met aunts and uncles, a lot of extended family. They got to know my adoptive family. And it's been a beautiful, beautiful reunion. But always a little bittersweet at the core, because they didn't really talk about Betsy, that beautiful sister who had passed over 2 years before I even knew about her existence. And to me, it was still a gaping wound for them. Lots of pain around her loss when she was 36 years old. And I wanted to know so much more, but that was very hard to come by because they weren't very comfortable talking about it and sharing. But I do remember my birth sister, Kathy, promised to someday send me a picture of Betsy. And she did. That picture arrived 4 months after my coma. And I remember pulling it out of the envelope, and she had emblazoned this poem across the picture. And it's a beautiful poem. The poem is in the book Proof of Heaven. It was written by David Romano, and it's called When Tomorrow Starts Without Me. And I remember I started reading that poem, and tears started filling my eyes. And I was just overcome with this incredible grief and emotion over the tragedy, just collapsing on the floor, just this horrible tragedy of losing this beautiful sister, long before I ever even knew of her existence. And I remember putting that picture up on the dresser, and the next morning I was in that room reading Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, Life After Death. She has a beautiful story in there of a 13-year-old girl who has a profound near-death experience, is in coma, and she encounters her brother, and he serves that same function that the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing served for me, bringing that message of unconditional love. And he helped her to come back to this world. And as she came back and she was explaining it all to her father, and she said, "But I don't understand. I don't have a brother." And he said, "Well, you did have a brother, but he died 3 months before you were born, so we never told you about him." And that's when I looked up on my dresser and I recognized that picture of my birth sister, the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. And it's almost like she was looking at me as if to say, "Do you finally get it?" And it was taken 3 weeks before she left this physical world. And it's exactly how she looked at me on that butterfly wing. And I cannot tell you how powerful that changed everything forever. And I'd like to close by just reminding you of that beautiful message that she gave me that really is a message for each and every one of us, because we are one soul. 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 We are one consciousness. This is all about all of us and all of this world. And it's time to get together and overcome those false boundaries of separation. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. Thank you very much.
In 1980, I was a rough and ready kind of a guy. I drank a lot and partied a lot, and I was moved to Tucson, Arizona, and I was working at a construction site, and one of the guys brought some water from Mexico that was contaminated, and I ended up drinking it by accident. Got real sick, contracted cholera, and within about 72 hours I was flat on my back and basically dehydrated. That's when I passed away. I noticed that when I passed on, that of course I wear glasses and I'm very nearsighted. I noticed that, the first thing I noticed is that I wasn't wearing my glasses and I could see clearly across the room. And when I turned my head, I noticed that my body wasn't moving. And I was lifted right out of my body and hovered over my body, looking down at myself and looking around. And next thing I knew, I went through the ceiling of the room I was in, and I was transported into a very, very, very black, dark void. I could hear like somebody speaking to me, like telepathy. And it was explaining to me many, many things that I no longer remember, but most of the idea was explaining to you the whys of life, why there was evil in the world, why this, why, people have questions all the time. These were being answered to you as you were being transported to this light. And time you got to where the light was, you knew what happened. You know what's going on. You know what happened. You know you died. You know you're going to be judged. And everything as you're traveling, it's made so clear to you that what's happening is perfectly just and right. Oh yeah, I was going through the darkness and I was approaching the light there. And I noticed that on this rock, it was a big, huge boulder right out in the middle of this darkness. And there was a person sitting on a throne. And the individual that was sitting on it was emanating light, very, very powerful, bright light. And there was a love and compassion too, but also a firmness and fairness emanating from this person. And I'm going, you know, who is this? And the basic question that was coming to me through this thought was, look what you have done with God's gift. It was actually Jesus was speaking this to me. He said, if I let you into heaven with what you know now, that I'm just, right, perfect, you would misuse that and keep sin alive in heaven. You can't come in. He told me it was granted to me to see a land unknown that's best forgotten, but will not be left unseen. That was it. And then he took out all these keys out of his robe, just pulled them out. And as he pulled them out, you could see the scar where the nails were kind of like in the wrist area, and it kind of pulled the bones apart. It's kind of traumatic looking. And he had these keys, and the keys were odd shapes and design. And he opened up he walked over to a place, and he stuck this key into this, looked like a gate. And a door opened. Then the veil came over, and it was dark again. I couldn't see it. All I could see was the Lord. And I was being moved toward this door, and I went through that door into a void. I mean, a tornado vortex. It was just going round and round. It was a tunnel, spinning horrendously around, just roaring and roaring and spinning and spinning and spinning. And it smelled horrible. I could hear these screeches and noises and sirens. The most thing I remember the most was slurping noises and screams, and you could feel heat, really hot heat. The next thing you know, I was falling through the sky. It looked like the sky, and I hit the ground. You know, it kind of hurt, and I stood up, and I looked, and I go, where am I? All these people ran out, and some of them looked like people that were dead that I knew, and other people I knew that were not dead. And they come around me, slapping me on the back. And I said, they got there awful quick because the house looked far away, but all of a sudden they were there, slapping me on the back, welcoming me there. But something just wasn't quite right with them because they looked weird. They had yellow glints in their eye, and their eyes were almost reptile-like. I looked over and I saw what looked like my best friend turn into somebody else. And I said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do that. You're not who you say you are. Who are you? And then all of a sudden I looked around and I go, all these people around me are not people. They begin to morph into what they were. They were ugliest creatures I've ever seen. Reptile-like, some of them, they were just god-awful, like rotting vegetables, and they were distorted and twisted, and then they were not perfect by no means. And they were just filthy, smelly creatures. And they were just starting to come at me like they're going to shred me to pieces. And one tried to grab me right across my chest, and one tried to grab my legs. And while they're trying to tear you to pieces, they backed away, and this one that looked like my best friend earlier, who morphed into different people, came up to me. It was it was about 4'8", looked like a sort of half dinosaur, a reptilian type creature, and it was hissing and spitting at me, and was speaking in a language that I didn't know what it was saying at first. I was telling, and it was broken in English. It was telling me to come, follow it, follow it, follow it. So he motioned to me, and we took a few steps, and all of a sudden we were at the end of the horizon. Now, that doesn't make any sense, but we came across to what looked like the end of the horizon. You couldn't go any further, and I couldn't understand what it was. And yet I could look out, and I could see all this vast fields and mountains. And then that creature stuck its hand in this horizon, and he ripped it open like a veil, and he stepped out of it up onto this road, and he telling me to come, motioning me to come. So I did the same. I just went ahead, I got up, and next thing I knew, I was on a large, wide, dusty, flat road. I just came out of a cell, a cube. It was around 10 by 10 foot square. It could have been 14 by 14. That's what the dimensions were. And there was a cell next to it, and there was a cells above it, kind of set back, concave, so they're going up. And there were 6 of them to the roof of of this place. And in the walls are embedded peoples in cells. And he pointed to another cube, and in this cube I was looking at, there were people inside these cubes. Some were vacant, some people waiting for people to arrive like I did. There's this person in there, and I was just looking at them, and then it was showing me another person. Each person that was in their cube was like they were reliving parts of their life all over again, but and not in a very pleasant way. It's like a living nightmare. And as we were walking along, I realized that hell is just an enormous big place, and there's many other parts to hell that I did not see. I just saw this place called the pit. And so it says, "It's been granted to thee, follow me out to the middle of the road." So he walked out in the middle of the road, and all these demons and creatures running around, and I saw all these people in various stages of torment. And some of these demon creatures inside these cubes were going in at will. And they would be attacking people in various ways. But to the people, they look like other people, or times in their lives, or they look like demons. Whatever their worst nightmare was is basically what they were living. We walked along to another cube, looked inside of another individual that was there, and it reminded me of an old sailing ship. And this guy used to be a captain of the ship, and he was being flogged. Things that he did on this old sailing ship, but he did it for pleasure for these people because it was his ship, and he liked to be mean to his crew, and it was being meted back to him. I noticed this being, this creature looking at me. It was in a cube at first, and the person who was looking at this creature is one of those tall creatures with the faces that went around, but it was of a beautiful purplish color in a way, kind of a beautiful creature, but hideous at the same time. And with its faces revolving around, very seductive, very, very flattering, very, very persuasive. It would try to plant thoughts in your mind, trying to tell you, why would such a good God allow people to suffer like this? It was trying to get me to curse God. I really don't know who the demon creature was. I know he had great power and authority. He either was the second in command or he could have been Satan himself. This one vortex was spinning, and a lady that had just died in a car wreck came through, and she was deposited right there. And I saw her as she arrived, and inside her cube, she saw it as the illusion of her grandmother's farm, her grandparents' farm that she loved so well as when she was growing up. And her grandmother recently passed away too, so she got in this cube, and immediately she thought she was in heaven because there was a grandmother waiting there welcoming her. The grandmother that was actually a demon that gave the illusion of being the grandmother said, "Dear Pudding, you made it to heaven. I'm so glad you're here." And she really thought that she was in paradise. But there was a darker side to her. She would make her children be what she wanted. Her children wanted something else. She wanted them to be this. And if they didn't do it her way, it was the fist. It was verbal abuse. It was cutting down. So as she sat down, I was watching it, and the tree's limbs just grabbed her. And then she realized she was not in paradise. And as we passed some cubes, there were people inside, and they were trapped in flames. And it was like their skin was still intact, but they were burning. And there was this individual, and he was playing pool. And this guy was a child serial killer, but he lived in the 1940s. But he was in this pool hall playing this pool before the punishments would commence again. He thought he had a break. And then these people in there would torment him and come and run and just grab him and tear him up. And out of the sky, I could see this big demon coming down. It reminds me of a snake. He just gobbled him and swallowed him. Then all these other little demons came up and said, that's no fair. We didn't have our chance with him yet. Regurgitated him back up. He was whole. I know this sounds really bizarre, but that's what happened. Then all the other little demons, little teeny things, about 1 foot, 3 foot tall, just jumped on him and he was powerless. And they were beating him and clawing him, and there was no rest for this guy whatsoever after that. It was constant torment. Everything that he ever done was being justly put back to him. Came to a cube, and I was looking at this, and this was a woman. She was dressed in fine garb. She was a temple prostitute, basically what it was. And she was somebody who died in Corinth around 69 AD. For a price, she would have a newborn son. For some reason, their religion was some strange thing. When you have a newborn son, you can offer it into a statue, and there's flames underneath the statue. You put the baby on the statue, and basically the baby would be cooked. And here she is in this temple. There was no let up to her torment. It was almost like all the little babies that she burned that were hers and other people's were tormenting her, mocking her, pouncing on her, just crawling and tearing her up. And she just screamed, and I had to turn away and walk. There was an individual that she practiced the black dark craft. She was a witch. I just knew that she was a witch, but she died many hundreds of years ago. But she was trapped in a coffin, scratching, trying to get out. She couldn't get out. She was in that position for years and years and years and years, hundreds of years. And then finally, when she got it open, all the demons would pounce on her. And I walked on to another cube. We looked in this other cube on this row, and there was another lady. And she believed that Mother Earth could save her, and that if she honored the trees and the rocks, and she was into this nature thing, and part of their religious practice that she would practice would be getting out in the fields and dancing around a fire with a bunch of other people doing the same. The people that she thought that she was with were actually demons, and they would come up to her and say, "You did this." They pick up a stone. You say, "The stone will save you here," and they smacked her with it. So she was standing there, and the demons reached down there and reached in her mouth, ripped out her tongue and part of her thing, and says, "You talk bad? Oh, the stones are not going to save you. Nobody can save you." Then they ripped off her, just actually took her skin and just peeled it off. It was really slow and agonizing to shreds until nothing to the skeletons. Then they took the bones and broke the bones, and she felt everything. Then her body would come back together. The flesh would come back together, and she'd be whole again, and it would start all over again. A different scene would happen. And some of the cruelest people on earth were in these. You know, some people, I don't like to say names of people or anything like that, but I will, you know, this one particular individual is definitely there, and everybody knows who it is. It's Adolf Hitler. Hitler was sitting in a cube. The cube was open, and it was just burning flames. He's just sitting there burning. And his flesh wasn't burning, and he had this hideous look on his face. And as he was burning, the flesh would be rotting, and he was feeling every bit of it. It was almost like every oven of the gas, of the concentration camps, all the tortures that went on there were being meted back to him in one intense flaming bit of stoked up white hot heat that would rot his flesh away at the same time, make him ashes, come back. He was just being tormented like that. He was just, I remember having a weird look on his eyes. It was just angry, vicious anger.
When we return, Bryan Melvin tells how for a moment he thought he may be trapped in hell for all eternity.
And we were walking in another segment of hell near the back recesses of the wall, another segment of the deep dark pit. And we're coming to this one pit there was one place, and the cube was open, and inside there, this demon was trying to get me to go inside this cube in what looked like a dentist chair. I'm not afraid of dentists at all, but this thing looked like a dentist chair to me, with all these hideous creatures in there trying to say, "This is where you are going. And they want you in this cube here." And they were trying to get me in there, and I didn't want to go. And this part is very hard for me, because you got to understand, you are so scared. And this whole time you're there, you're just saying, "Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ." By that time, I was probably saying Jesus Christ so fast, Jesus Christ so fast that it was a blur. That's all I can say. They wanted me in this cube, and I was scared. I didn't want to go in this thing. And like I said, throughout the whole time, you felt a connection with somebody from above, the Lord. And then all of a sudden, you could feel something coming for you. I was so petrified, I couldn't distinguish what it was. You could feel the footsteps walking behind you, and the ground thundering. And as it closer, whatever it was walking behind me. And I was too scared to turn away to see who it was, because I didn't want these things to rush me and grab me. And all of a sudden, they started coming toward me. And then the presence got right behind me, and they all scattered. And that purplish, big, tall, demonic creature, the regal creature, kind of backed slightly away and kind of bowed and kind of walked out, just kind of slithered on into the mist, into the darkness of hell. And the Lord was carrying me up. And I knew who it was. It was Jesus. He picked me up. This part I remember though so clearly. He just picked me up in his arms, and I could see where they crucified him. As he's holding me, his bones are pulled apart. He's saying, "You pulled apart my bones." And he carried me. And kind of floated through the air and went through the center of the bottomless pit. I went straight up. I remember bits and pieces of being taken to a hospital and waking up in a hospital room. And nurses poking me. And when I woke up out of this thing trying to breathe, I grabbed the doctor and said, "I'm not in a cube, am I?" "I better not be in a cube." And the doctor says, "No, you're in a hospital." And from it, I was no longer an atheist. There was a God, there is a heaven, and there is a hell.
Life is a journey, but what happens when we die? Is it the end, or is it just the beginning? As an atheist, Howard Storm was convinced that death marked the end of consciousness. But then he died and went to hell.
Eternal life with God the Father, Jesus and Mary, the angels, the saints, and our loved ones. It is the heavenly existence most God-fearing people hope to experience, and which some have even claimed to have seen. Eternal damnation in the fiery pit of hell is a concept no one likes to consider. Yet it is a poignantly real nightmare for countless lost souls, those who die in a state of mortal sin, and self-absorbed individuals whose lives here on earth had one common denominator: the complete rejection of God and the denial of his existence. While on earth, they tossed God into the swirling sea of reasoning, a cesspool of ideologies and philosophies that claim man is master of his own fate, that powerful careers and making lots of money are the true measures of success, the formulas for happiness and fulfillment, and that in the end, all that is left, all that really matters, is our portfolio of personal accomplishments, the monuments to our ego. But after death, those human monuments come crashing down. Without God, there is only darkness and the frightening realization that hell truly exists. In the words of Protestant minister Howard Storm, it is the sewer of the universe, a foreboding place where lost souls feed off the pain of others. Storm knows this firsthand. In 1985, this self-proclaimed atheist died, and to his horror found that he had been banished to hell.
Howard, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to begin with just the issue of who you were in 1985, because by all measurements, you were an average art professor, probably very good artist.
Thank you.
I've seen your work, so I know that you're a good artist. But you were just the average person out there. You had not, as far as we know, committed any heinous crime of any sort.
Right.
And yet, when you die, you're sent to hell. And that could have been anybody out there who's leading a good life. Why? What were you? Who were you?
Well, unfortunately, I say that from my perspective now, we are all sold a bill of goods in this society that, like, being good is good enough. And what we mean by being good is if you don't kick the dog and, you know, aren't too nasty to your wife and kids and pay your taxes and don't break the laws in any conspicuous way, that's good. And being self-centered and manipulative and me first always kind of attitude is encouraged in our society. So I look upon myself then as living the American dream, and I think many people would say I was you know, on the right track. But that's not why we're in this world and not why we were created and not what is expected of us to do with our lives. And that's what I learned.
You were self-centered, but you were also so self-centered that you didn't think there was any other force out there that would determine your future, like God. You did not believe in God?
Now, sometime when I went to college, I was 17 years old, I just gave up on the whole God thing. And you know, my philosophy professor ridiculed it all as like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and stuff like that. And these are, basically the idea was religion was the opiate of the masses. It was like for addled-brained people that couldn't deal with the harsh reality of existence. And I thought I was way beyond religion into a existential, very materialistic, you know, very hedonistic kind of life, which I think, from my perception, is the prevailing culture of our society.
And you were building your own human legacy, which you thought would help see your name live on forever and ever, long after you were gone to nowhere.
Right.
What were you doing? You were creating works of art?
Well, I was doing painting and sculpture, and I was having my own small success. I was named Sculptor of the Year in the state of Kentucky. That was a biggie for me and stuff like that. You know, sell some work once in a while, win a prize, and you know, there was always that next level you were trying to get to. You know, as soon as you made one level of success, it was like you set your eyes on the next one, always striving, always working to prove, basically, that you were of worth, that you were of value to the world.
But you had some struggles during those times, obviously. Who did you turn to? What did you turn to? I know you had some sort of religion instilled in you when you were younger. You didn't turn back to that at all? You never felt like you should? There was never that gnawing feeling?
No, because as an academic, we all ridiculed those things. So when I'm not proud of this, but who I turned to was alcohol. You know, going out, staying out all night with my friends and going to hip artsy bars in Cincinnati and being really cool and listening to jazz music and getting intoxicated to the point where you're worried about whether you can make it home or not. I mean, that was my religion. And it's also an anesthetic, because inside of me there was a great emptiness, a great darkness that I couldn't fill with anything.
And you felt that? You felt that void?
And unfortunately there were times when I really thought about killing myself, because it was like, is the pain of being alive, and I'm not talking about an acute pain. This is like the pain is more like a numbness. It's hard to explain. The angst of being alive, is it worth it? You know, wouldn't it be better just to drive the car into a, you know, bridge abutment and put an end to it?
And so in 1985, how old were you? About 38 years old. You're in Paris with your wife on an art convention of sorts.
Right, art tour with a bunch of students.
Right.
I had at 11 o'clock on Saturday morning, I had a whole break in my small stomach, which is the duodenum, and I may have had a ulcerous condition that I was unaware of, or it might have been from a foreign object, like a small shard of glass or something. I don't know, but I was taken to the big city emergency room.
Well, wait a minute. You collapsed on the floor, though, in this.
Oh, yeah.
You're writhing in pain. You're writhing in pain.
Without any exaggeration, it was like being on fire inside.
Like rats were eating you up inside.
Yeah,
It was
it
an
was-
acid release that was
Yeah,
literally eating your inside?
The things that dissolve your food, the hydrochloric acid and the enzymes and things, were leaking into my abdominal cavity, literally digesting myself on the inside. So it's kind of eating myself up. And it was the most acute pain I'd ever experienced.
And they called an ambulance,
Yeah.
and a doctor comes with, diagnoses.
Oh
your
yeah, they knew
condition
exactly what was wrong. Sent me off on this wild ambulance ride through Paris.
with a shot of morphine, only
Yeah.
one shot.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as he explained, it was only enough to get me to the hospital because he said, you're going to have surgery as soon as you get there, and I can't give you any more because it'll interfere with the anesthetic that they're going to administer when you have the surgery. And our understanding then and in emergency was this is an extremely grave situation, like having a burst appendix. But if you get right on it and do surgery, 4 weeks, 6 weeks later, you're pretty good shape. 8 to 12 weeks later, and you're good as new, no problem. If you let it go, it's fatal, you know, because of the damage that it does to your insides, which is the infection of peritonitis and the digestive juices messing up your organs. So I was sent from the emergency hospital over to a surgical hospital several blocks away. And unbeknownst to my wife and I, there was no surgeon available at the surgical hospital to do the surgery. So they parked me in a room and left me there for 10 hours. And the doctors in the United States told me that my life expectancy from the beginning of this incident was about 5 hours. So I was in really bad shape.
Yeah, they
in
kept
pain.
coming in and telling you that it would be soon, and
Yeah.
then eventually they said the only doctor there had gone home.
Yeah.
And they couldn't give you any more morphine or any pain reliever because a doctor
I was never
had-
given any
a doctor had
further
to administer
medication
it.
because only the doctor could prescribe medicine. I was never seen by a doctor from the time I went into that surgical hospital.
So they come in, they say, look, the doctor's gone home, you can't have the surgery today.
Right. This is
And-
about 8:30 at night now.
And they leave, the person leaves, and
And I turned to my wife, my wife tells me this was the worst day of her life, too, because here she is watching her husband. She's just losing her husband. My wife was an attorney then.
Yeah.
And she didn't know a woman of some capability and power and influence in the world. And to watch your husband just gradually die in front of your eyes and nobody cares, I said to my wife, it's time for us to say goodbye. And she got up from the chair, which was next to the bed, and she put her arms around me and kissed me and held me. And we told each other how much we loved each other. And every time I go down this road,
Go ahead.
it makes me sad, but, you know, to say goodbye, I mean, and we knew it was forever. And I knew that when you die, I mean, I knew this absolutely positively, when you die, that's it. There is nothing else. This is what I knew. You're a biochemical organism made up of 75 trillion cells or whatever, and when the organism ceases to function, the biochemical, functions begin to fail, and you lose consciousness, and then you're dead, and then your body rots, and that's all there is. And anything that would be left of you would be like maybe your kids or something would remember you for a generation, or maybe if you made something like a bridge or some artwork, you'd be remembered for a little while. But that was it. I mean, I knew that, absolutely. And everybody I knew that. You know, this was a certainty. So when we said goodbye, I was saying goodbye to oblivion. And eventually, she was crying so hard she sat back down, and I closed my eyes and went into unconsciousness.
And you, before you went into unconsciousness, you felt a bit of relief, too, that you could escape this horrible pain, and was there a feeling of sort of calm about it as well to you?
Yeah, I wanted to die because since they said there wasn't going to be a doctor until the next day, and I had felt for many hours like I was dying. And medically, I had good reason to feel that way because I really was dying. And the pain, which had gone from a pain that, I was a big, strong guy, 38 years old, had played football in high school and stuff like that. This pain threw me down to the ground, kicking and screaming and yelling. And from that point on, it just went worse and worse and worse and worse. I was ready to be out, you know. I was ready to be gone because I can't do this anymore. You know, you can do it for 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, but I was at the point of like close to 10 hours, and I'd had it. So I was ready to go. And so here, you know, people ask me all the time, were you dead? Well, it's an impossible question to answer because I had no medical attention. No one ever took my temperature. Nobody ever put the blood pressure cuff on me or anything, so nobody was examining me. But the fact of the matter was, it's a ridiculous argument. I was dying, as much as anybody can be dying in that state.
Mm-hmm. So you go into unconsciousness,
Yeah.
and then what?
To my
The shock of your life.
To my complete surprise, I was standing next to the bed that I had been lying in, and there's my wife, and I'm standing up, and I know the situation. I'm completely clear about my problem, and I know I have to have surgery, and that I'm sick, and I have a perforated duodenum, and all that stuff. But I feel pretty good. Matter of fact, parts of me feel quite good, better than they've ever felt in my life, really alive. And I try to communicate with my wife, who, it appeared to me, was ignoring me.
You were next to her? You were
I was on the other side of
level?
the bed from her.
Okay.
And I thought she was pretending that she could neither hear me nor see me. Of course, in fact, she couldn't hear me or see me. And then I realized that the bed that I had been in was occupied with a thing. And as I examined the thing, which was covered up to the neck with a sheet, and bent over and looked at the face, which was turned away from me, turned towards my wife, I realized that it looked remarkably like me. Now, this was all very confusing, because how did somebody get in my bed who looked like me? Because it wasn't me, because I was alive. Mm-hmm. And I knew that the thing in the bed was, an inanimate object. Mm-hmm. I knew that about it. And so, you know, part of me was like, that's me, but how could it be me? Because this is impossible.
Because here I am.
Yeah, and so I couldn't figure this out. So I turned to my roommate, who was a 68-year-old, very kind Frenchman by the name of Monsieur Florent, and I yelled and screamed in his face to find an answer to this problem. And he looked through me without blinking or any response at all, just as if I wasn't screaming in his face. Now, I didn't know why my wife would ignore me, but I couldn't figure out why Monsieur Florent would ignore me. I mean, and so I heard people outside the room calling me by name. And so I went over to the doorway of the room, and I said, are you from the doctor? I'm really sick. I have to have surgery. You know, I've been waiting a long time. I'm really in bad shape. And they said things like, we've been waiting for you a long time. It's time for you to go. Hurry up. We can't wait any longer. We know all about you. Let's go. Things like that. So I thought that meant, yes, they were from the doctor to take me to surgery.
And they spoke English, and nobody else was speaking English to
Yeah,
you.
I thought that was very weird, because everybody else in the hospital spoke with a very thick French accent,
Right.
or no English at all. But these people were, well, and also I thought, they want me to walk to surgery? You know, but after what I'd experienced in this hospital, okay, it's, you know, it's the way they do things here. So I left the room, and when I left the room, I had a really bad feeling about leaving the room, because the room was bright and clear and light. The room was very bright. There was a lot of light in the room. And the hallway was hazy. It wasn't dark. It was just foggy and hazy and dim and very unclear. But I went with these people, and I had a strong sense that I was leaving that room forever. And we continued on a journey that was ridiculously long.
What were they saying to you? They were saying, just come closer, and you kept following? Or what were they saying to you as you were
They were
following
very insistent. Hurry up, we've got to go. You know, we've waited for you so long. You know, we've got to take you there. They were very insistent and very clear about what they want to do, and there was about a dozen of them, and they were around
What did they
me.
look like? Were they close to you?
Men and
or?
women, very, very pale. Everything was gray. The clothing was totally plain and gray. Almost could have been like hospital scrubs, only pale gray. They were all adults, men and women, and they were very pale. And I mean, they weren't particularly scary at this point.
Right.
And as we went along, they became crueler and more insistent. And
When you say crueler, what
let's
were
go, come on, you're slowing down, keep going, keep moving.
And they made fun of you, too.
Yeah, and they started ridiculing me and things like that. And I started to get really scared, but where was I to go? We were in this endless space, moving along, and I didn't know where we were going, and I'm beginning to realize that this is not going to work out good. This isn't the hospital. They aren't from a doctor. I mean, I'm beginning, this is all dawning on me that this is, something's going very wrong here, but there's nothing for me to do. So finally, we're in real darkness now, and I said to him, I'm not going any further, which was a bluff because I had no sense of orientation which way to go. And they said, well, you're almost there, and they started to push and pull at me, and I tried to defend myself. And although I just had the worst day of my life and had been dying, I felt very strong. I wasn't the least bit tired. But the fight was, the sensations of the fight were just like if it had happened in this world. You know, when I hit them, I felt it. When they harmed me, I felt it. But they had no sensation. No matter what I did to them, it had no effect on them.
And the whole time they were hitting you, and I know earlier they were heckling and saying, "Oh, he hears us." They were making fun of you because your gown didn't cover your entire body and making fun of that. And at this point, what were they saying to you? They were screaming obscenities at you, or
and laughing a lot. There was a lot of laughter, and you know, it's really hard for me to talk about this, but you know, it's like he really hates this, as someone was gouging me in the eye or other things. And their purpose was entirely to humiliate me, not to destroy me, but to humiliate me in the biting and scratching and you know, violating me in all kinds of ways. And
you wrote in the book that when they actually came in physical contact with you, even though you had seen what appeared to be clothing on them, you didn't feel any clothing at that point.
Right.
And that they were like humans, but they had what? Describe
well,
what they
their
were.
nails seemed very harsh and sharp, and a lot of them were biting me. And I've not been bit a lot in my life, but they seemed to have exceptionally sharp, jagged teeth as they were biting and gnawing on me.
They're just ripping your flesh from your body, ripping it apart?
Well, if they'd really wanted to do that, they could have had done with me in a few minutes.
Right.
No, they wanted to torment me. And so what they were doing was really simple. They were trying to inflict pain. And it was clear to me that these people had no, what we would think of as compassion, no love, no human sensation of their own. So what they were doing was they were feeding off my pain, if that makes any sense, that gave them
pleasure.
It gave them some kind of pleasure to get as much pain out of me as possible. And so they were trying to prolong that as much as possible.
How would you describe that kind of pain? You went through excruciating pain in the hospital, obviously. Yeah. Was it 10 times worse than that, or?
It was much worse physically, but what hurt more about it was them doing it to me. You know, as a human being and as a man, and they did a lot of unspeakable things to me, which are just. How could someone do this to you? That's what hurt more. Their utter lack of any interest in me other than to hurt me is what really hurt, more than the physical pain. And this just went on and on and on and on and on. I don't ever think about it, because if I even get close to it, I get really upset. So, and there are certain things in the world that I don't like because they remind me of it. And
you wrote that it actually traumatizes you when you think about it.
And like I can't go to a bar and stuff because the noise in there and stuff, it's too, it's not the same, but it's just a little bit of comparison between the kind of frivolity of a bunch of drunks in a bar, you know, to what I experienced there. I don't like really loud music because of it. But anyhow, so I was lying in that place, all torn up, broken up, beat up, but more importantly, emotionally destroyed. And people were kicking me, and I couldn't respond anymore. I couldn't even moan or groan or anything. I was lying in a fetal position, just sort of trying to protect myself, all ripped up, and people were kicking me, and they were expressing their disappointment that I didn't have any more response to what they were doing. And I heard, strangely, my voice, although I distinctly did not say it, pray to God. And I thought to myself, being an atheist, like, what a dumb idea, I don't believe in God. And the second time, pray to God, and I thought, I haven't prayed, you know, in my adult life. I had stopped praying when I was like 15 or something. And I'm 38 now, so I had no remembrance of prayer. I thought, I wouldn't even know how to pray if I wanted to pray. And then a third time, it said pray to God, and I was thinking, what did I say when I was a kid? I was not intending to pray. I was just sort of curious if there was a prayer somewhere in my memory. And I was trying to remember things, and it all got mixed up with the Pledge of Allegiance and the National Anthem. It just became this big confused mess with the 23rd Psalm and the Our Father and things like that. And it was all these little phrases mixed up here and there in my mind. And really wanted to grasp at some of this stuff. I wanted to recall this. And I accidentally muttered a couple phrases, and the people around me could not bear to have the mention of God. And they told me so in the most filthy, horrible language that they wanted me to stop, to not talk about God, and now they were going to really hurt me if I didn't stop. But because it was so repulsive to them and literally pushing them into the darkness, it encouraged me to try and... So I was just trying to think of phrases from these memories, and they're screaming and yelling at me to stop, and I'm trying to remember these things, and eventually I'm all alone in that place. And it's hard for people to understand, but I was left alone in that darkness, in my gore and in my pain, forever and ever and ever. And it's impossible to talk about. But that was the real hell.
Because you knew. And you wrote in your book that you were in the sewer of the universe.
Yeah, and I knew that I was going to be there forever. You know, and it was so bad being alone in that place that it was even like, well, maybe some of them will come back. You know, not all of them, but maybe, you know, I mean, you know, anything but just to be here. And as I looked over my life, I thought about what a failure I had been in terms of I had not been a good husband, I had not been a good father, I had not been a good teacher. Because the reason why I wasn't because I was always obsessed with what's in it for me. I was not the great artist that I'd hoped to be. I was just a mediocre artist, you know, at a mediocre university. Everything looked so bleak, and I was thinking, why was I ever born to end up in this place of horror and torment, and now just abject hopelessness and loneliness? I knew that I belonged there. There was absolutely no sense that, you know, they got the wrong guy, or you know, I'm innocent, you know. I knew that the people that had attacked me earlier had been people like me. I'm not proud of this, I'm really ashamed of this, but there was a spiritual affinity between them and me. They were like soulmates, if you will. And that my only hope in this place was to somehow become one of them and no longer be their victim. But I didn't want to do that either because I hated them and I hated what they stood for and I hated their darkness and their cruelty and all that. And so the situation seemed to be so completely hopeless. I knew that I was never going to see my wife again. I was never going to see the world again. I didn't know where I was, but I knew that I was in the garbage heap. I was in the cesspool. And I knew that when you die, your consciousness and who you are keeps going. Mm-hmm. And it was going to go on forever. I knew that I could never be extinguished. And
what were you thinking about God at that point?
I got the strangest, vivid memory in my mind of myself as a child, maybe like 8 years old, sitting in a Sunday school classroom, and we were singing Jesus Loves Me. And not only did I get the memory of myself as a child doing this, but I could also feel what I had felt as a sweet, innocent child. Just as simple as possible, that there was a goodness in the universe, unknowable goodness, much greater and bigger than anything that we could understand out there. And its name was Jesus, and that this goodness really cared about me, really loved me. I mean, not generically, but specifically cared about me, this really great, wonderful, I hate to call him a man, but this personage, Jesus, who was unlike any human being in his greatness and his power and his goodness.
So this inspiration was being given to you at this point then?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And it was a very powerful memory. Well, you can imagine, as deep in despair as I was, this was like, and this would be like giving the Hope Diamond to a pauper on the street. I mean, this is like, you know, I'm going to go for this, because this is like the first ray of hope I've seen in this whole scenario.
And you didn't think in some way you were hallucinating, this was a bad dream, it was all going to end. You just knew this was real.
This was far more real than any experience of reality I've ever had in my life. People can understand, this world is a dream compared to the afterlife. Now people think, well, all I know is this, so the afterlife must be dreamlike. They're completely wrong. This is the dream. Your sensations are fewer in this world. Your feelings and knowledge and abilities are much fewer in this world than they will be in the next world. Whether you're going up or down, you're going to have a much new sense of what it means to be who you are. And I called out in that darkness, not knowing if Jesus was real, but simply hoping, based on that childhood faith, that that he would be real. But I didn't, you know. So I said, "Jesus, please save me." And with that, a tiny pinpoint of light appeared in that darkness, and very rapidly got brighter and brighter. And then this huge, impossibly bright, white, warm light was over me, and I felt hands in this light picking me up into it. And also, because I was now in light for the first time, I saw how horrible I was, and I looked like
you weren't scared though?
No, I was amazed and in awe, but not afraid, because it was just so beautiful and like wonderful. And it was a little bit scary, but it was like just so great, you know. And as he touched me and picked me up, all that gore, all that horror that was me, all went away, and I was made whole physically, but more importantly, all the pain inside of me was filled with ecstasy. And the ecstasy, quite simply, was the incredibly powerful sense of love that he was sharing me, that his love for me. And I knew several things immediately. One, that this was indeed who I'd called out to. This was Jesus. This was a person of great power. This was a person of unbelievable goodness, just pure, perfect goodness. I don't know how I knew it, but I knew he was really smart, and that I knew nothing compared to what he knew. I knew that he knew everything about me, even everything I'd ever forgotten, he knew. I knew that he knew me more intimately than I knew me.
How'd that make you feel, though? You knew some
worried.
bad thing, yeah.
I was worried about that. But it was all good, because he loved me so much, and I can't begin to describe. You know, I wish that there was some way that I could manufacture or create some kind of substitute experience for people, and how much God loves them, how much Jesus loves them, because it would totally change their lives. And they can have that experience, but I can't do it for them.
Right.
They have to do it for themselves.
What did he look like? How can you describe him, if you can?
Well, at this time, he was just bright, white light, and all I could do was feel him. And he held me against him, and he embraced me, hugged me, and stroked my back like a mother would a lost child, you know, sort of there, and comfort me. And I did the only reasonable thing. I cried like a baby and slobbered on it. I was like really embarrassed because I was slobbering on it because I was crying so hard. And he was rubbing my back and holding me, and then we began to go out of that place. We just went straight up and away from there.
And was he alone? Were there angels around him?
At this point, it was just he and I, and as we moved towards more light and more points of light, I became aware that all those points of light weren't things, that they were people like him, which I like to refer to as angels or saints, whatever. And they were all moving, and way off in the distance was a great center of light, and we were moving towards that, and I all of a sudden felt terribly ashamed, because I felt like I was such a piece of garbage, and this was so holy and good. And I thought to myself, he's made awful mistake, and I don't belong here. And so we stopped at that point, and he said to me, we don't make mistakes, and you do belong here. And I was quite taken aback because he hadn't spoken to me up until this time, and he was speaking directly into my mind. And I could hear his voice, but it wasn't coming through my ear. And I also caught on that he was also hearing what I was thinking, which was a little more disconcerting. And then he said, after we exchanged some conversation this way, telepathically, he said that he had some people he wanted me to meet. And he called out with musical tones. And some of these angels came, and we're all in space now. We're not in heaven and we're not in hell. We're just in between. And they came and we made more talk, and they said that they wanted to show me my life. And interestingly, they had a complete record of my life, these angels. They had recorded every minute of my life, including my thoughts, my feelings, including the feelings and thoughts of the people that I'd interacted with, including even things that had happened to the people that I interacted with that I wasn't aware of, like the bad day my dad had at the office and came home and he and I had a fight. And I got to see what he went through.
You saw everything or just bits and pieces?
Episodes.
Episodes.
Yeah, I didn't see my entire life. We just went through episodes starting in a chronological order. And
how did you see it? Was it you saw it in your mind? There was actually like
no, it was real strange. It was like watching a play on a stage, and there were just actors, and there were hardly any sets. So if it was like my mother and I talking, and my mother drinking coffee at the kitchen table, it was like the table and my mom and her, maybe a little bit of the linoleum, but the counters weren't there.
Right.
Because what they were showing me was that all that really mattered was how I had interacted with people, whether I had been a compassionate person or not. That's all they were interested in. We would get up to points in my life where I would, you know, have an accomplishment, like win an 8 high school shot put meet or something, which was my big event in high school, was shot put. And they'd skip over it. I said, wait a minute, I wanted a shot put there. I worked really hard to get to that point, you know. And I said, well, that's not important. What's really important is this, and they'd show me how I'd shown a little kindness to a really fat, uncoordinated kid who didn't know how to throw, and I was trying to teach him how to throw the shot, and I was like, they're going like, see, that's good stuff, you know? So
they showed you the good things, and when you looked at good things, it made them happy, and then when you saw the bad things, they became very sad?
Yeah, and extremely disappointed. I knew, fortunately, that they loved me, no matter what I did, but I knew that I majorly was letting them down, and that they very much disapproved of what they were seeing. But it was like, you know, we had such greater hopes for you than this.
And what was Jesus saying or doing at this point?
Holding me, loving me, and sharing his feelings about what we were watching in my life with me. And as we saw the bad things become more prevalent and the good things less prevalent as I matured, I felt very, very ashamed. And I didn't want him to see it, even though I knew, you know, I mean, it's ridiculous because he knows all this stuff. But I was like, I wanted to, you know, hide it from him. You know, don't watch this stuff, you know.
Was he angry with you, or was he just disappointed?
Not angry. Very, very disappointed.
Like a parent would be with a child.
Yeah, because he had really big hopes for me. Because he really, I mean, it's a weird thing to say, but when you're in with Jesus, it's like you're the most special person in the whole universe. That's the way he makes you feel. You know what I mean? He just makes you feel that you're just the most neatest, wonderful thing, and all of his attention and everything in the universe has been about making you a beautiful child of God. And with all the hope for the potential that could be. And I flunked. I flunked the very reason why I was put into this world, which is, one way of stating it is, as Jesus did, which is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That nice summary of what we're here to do, to love one another. And I had loved me. I made myself a God.
Had you loved yourself over your wife, over your children? I'm sure you loved your family.
Yeah,
because most people say, but look, I'm working hard for my family. I'm doing the best I can. I love them, but I've got to do this, and I've got to do this, and that's why I've got to be away from them, and that's why I've got to try to strive to become number one,
Yeah.
because they're going to benefit. I mean, that's
Right,
the argument a lot
right.
of people make.
Absolutely, and you know, this it hurts me to say, but yeah, I loved myself a whole lot more than I loved them. But it was the rationale, as you said, was, hey, you know, what's good for me is good for them ultimately, right? You know,
Right.
so I neglected them and emotionally cheated on them. You know, we don't want to go into that too far.
Well, so you saw this view, and up to what point did they take you? Up until your marriage, until till
Oh no,
your
up
death?
to the present.
Uh-huh.
It was quite bleak, and I was so happy when it was over, because having been a teacher, I realized that I had, not only had I not passed the course, I had flunked the course.
You know, you're not Catholic, but a lot of Catholics would look at that and say, well, that's kind of like the purgatory we're taught about.
Yeah.
So it would be sort of like a purgatory.
Yeah,
place
and
where
I
you're...
heard a priest explain purgatory this way, which I think is really wonderful. He said, don't think of purgatory, this is a priest speaking, I'm quoting him, don't think of purgatory as a geographical place. Think of it as a state of being. And I certainly believe that we need to be purged or purified before we can go to heaven.
Even after our death, even though
Yeah,
we've
yeah.
accepted Jesus. Even if you've accepted Jesus as your Savior.
Absolutely, because none of us are perfect enough, pure enough to go to heaven. I mean, Mother Teresa would be the first one to tell you that she's, you know, she needs more perfection, filled with the goodness of Christ, and let go of whatever those little things that she might have been holding on to, you know, in her life. So I thank God for that purgation, or that purgatory, or whatever. But you don't want to think of it as like a country that we have to sort of make the journey through. Think of it as a process that's a wonderful grace of God that we're given, that we are made perfect by God so that we can go to heaven. And nobody is good enough to go to heaven without the love and the perfection of God interceding on our behalf.
So what happened next? So after you see this view of your life, then what?
Well, they said, do you have any questions? And I said, oh, I've got a million questions. And they said, well, ask whatever you want. And they were the most wonderful teachers, because they were trying to speak directly to my level of understanding, which was pathetically low in comparison to them. And I had, you know, like no theological or religious background or understanding at that point, so I didn't even know what was good stuff to ask. But so I asked all kinds of questions, historical questions, biblical questions. And everything I asked, they answered. A lot of times they showed me things. There were times when it was like we were there.
Right.
I would say, what would the future be like, and we'd be in the future. What was this like, and we'd be there. And it was very important experience, because people asked me, how long did this last? And I said, well, I learned a whole lot more than I ever learned in graduate school, which was 3 years. And this was a much more intense and thorough course. So I learned way more in this question and answer period, however long it took, which I don't know, than I'd learned going to the University of California, Berkeley.
Well, let's go through some of those questions.
Okay.
I don't know if we can tackle all of them, but let's go through some of them. What are some of the most important ones that you felt like you asked? I know you ask about, say, for example, you ask about Jesus in the Bible. You said, is that all that Jesus did? You know?
Right. And they said that, it was funny because this is in the Bible. I didn't know it at the time, but they said that if they'd written down all the things that Jesus did, it would fill all the books in the world. The world couldn't even hold all the books about what Jesus did when he was in this world. And, you know, Jesus is alive today. Jesus has been around from the beginning and is still around. And the reason why Christianity exists, and the only reason why it exists, is because millions of people have experienced his love, his presence, his power. They've experienced him in some way in their lives. And there are millions and millions of people, and there have been for over 2,000 years, that know that he is real, you know, and that he is what God has sent to us so that we can have a proper relationship with God.
And they told you that what's contained that he did much more, but what's contained within the pages of the Bible is all that we need to know to do what we're supposed to do on earth to get to heaven, to be with him.
You know, those 4 little Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, seem so little, but when you try and preach them every Sunday, there's so much there that there's more than a lifetime's worth of learning and preaching and understanding in what we know more than enough about Jesus to know that we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked also about how we got here and when God began and when he began, or was he always there? Talk about that for us.
Well, one of the things that I thought was interesting, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but that the creation didn't happen once a long time ago, and like, you know, that old idea that the clockmaker made the clock and then wound it up and it's been
Something
sort of like ticking ever since.
Yeah.
That God has been doing the creation and is doing the creation, and that we are invited to be a part of this. We have this, one of the terms for God is the creator, and it says we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we're invited to participate in the creation. And in this life, one of the ways that we do this, an obvious way, is to have children and to raise them. I mean, what more creative act could you possibly want, and what a more awesome responsibility than to have children and be responsible for their nurture and education and well-being.
And you wrote that he is a part of each and every one of us, and that he takes great joy in seeing each and every human being. But that seems so mind-boggling given the tremendous population on our earth, that he's actually
but
able.
the irony is that for God it's so easy. You know, if for God, God's conscious. See, because we can only project our sense of consciousness onto God and anthropomorphize God, but God's consciousness permeates everything. And one of the terms that we use for this is the Holy Spirit, that Spirit of God in the ways that God has revealed God's self to us. That Spirit is everywhere and through everything. You know, God is with the creation, and God is present to us. And we can either be aware of that and act accordingly, or we can be oblivious to it and deny that.
If you had not been sent back to earth, where might you have gone after you had left the angels and Jesus? What would you have gone to heaven at that point because you had been purged, or would you have had to go to another point where you'd have to learn something else before to reach a higher level, then another higher level?
I don't honestly know the answer, so I can only speculate, but I wasn't ready to go to heaven. I mean, they made it really clear to me that I was not a candidate at that point.
Were you shown where other people were going? I think you wrote about maybe somebody by a brook reading a famous novel of some sort.
Yeah, there are places where I could have gone and matured spiritually in God's whole creation, but I can't comprehend it all. It's way too beyond my understanding.
But you saw that? They gave you a vision of that?
Yeah.
So
God, see, the thing that people don't realize is that we constrain God and make God so small after our image. But God's love for us is without limit and so vast that God will do exactly the right thing for that individual, which God knows intimately what they need to develop in their spiritual journey.
And you wrote that heaven is nothing like the image we have of heaven here on earth.
No, and I don't understand, because it's really sad. Heaven is the center of all the creative activity of the universe. And of course, what's in the midst of heaven would be God, which is the source of everything that is. God is the source of not just life, but light, energy, space, time. There is nothing that isn't from God. And so to go into the unlimited variety of heaven and experience of heaven is the greatest joy in the whole universe. Every awake spiritual being in the universe wants to go to heaven and be with God. And the only beings that don't want to do that are beings that are tremendously deceived. And so when I use the word awake, you know, anyone that wakes up realizes that heaven is the next step. That's what you want to go to, and you want to live a life that would qualify you to be there.
Because I know even in the Catholic Church, it's taught that based on your spiritual level when you die, you go to a different level.
Right.
That some people might be at a higher level in heaven. And, you know, of course, the argument is, if you're in heaven, you're happy anyway, so what does it matter?
Right, and you've got all the time in the world to advance and grow. It's not like you're going to be stuck there forever. You know, you'll move on and grow.
Move up. And did you physically see souls or people speaking with? I know you wrote in your book maybe they would be speaking with a saint who had died before them. You saw that?
Yes, they showed me that.
Okay, so that would be one way to attain that higher spiritual level that you're talking about.
Right, and God doesn't coerce us. God's not going to do like surgery on us and make us right. God's going to let us grow into it.
For
at our own
eternity.
rate. Yeah.
Which is forever.
Yeah.
But what about religions? I know you got to talk about religions. You ask, which is the best religion out there? And you were expecting him to answer what?
Presbyterian, Methodist, Catholic, you know. So I expected to hear, yeah, become a Southern Baptist. You know, that's what I expected God to say, you know, Jesus to say to me. And instead, what he said was, there are good people in bad religions, and there are bad people in good religions, and that he told me, and this was specific to me, to seek out the religion that brought me closest to God, which ultimately, when I came back to this world, after months of trying to figure out what in the world that would mean, I went back to the tradition that my parents had raised me in, and that I'd grown up in, and that's the religion that I all of a sudden realized, boy, this really fits like a, you know, glove, because it was so much part of my formation as a child.
Well, what about the teaching, though? And since you're a Protestant, and nowhere in here do you ask him, do you have to say verbally, I believe in Jesus Christ as my Savior in order to get to heaven? You never ask him that.
No.
Why not?
At the time, I mean, I didn't ask a lot of things because I wasn't, you know, in any way religiously or theologically sophisticated. So, and also, during almost my whole experience with Jesus, I assumed I was going to heaven. I didn't know I was coming back here. I mean, I wasn't going to ask about looking back. I was looking forward.
But knowing what you know now, is that an important question?
Absolutely, and I've devoted my life to convincing people that that's the critical question. To make Jesus your Savior is to put your trust in him and to the best of your ability follow his teachings, to learn about him, to communicate him with prayer, to be his advocate and to stand up for what he believes and what he's given you to understand and believe, even at your expense.
But does that mean, because one thing that I seem to get out of your book, a theme, was that a Hindu or a Muslim that was following God's commandments, that loved God with all his or her heart or soul, that was trying to be a good person and be the person God intended them to be, would be able to get to heaven as well, even though they may not have said verbally, I believe in Jesus Christ.
They will, because the Bible says that no one comes to the Father except through the Son, and that everybody in the universe, and I can point this out many times in the Bible, is going to meet Jesus. If they have the spirit of love in them, they will know him and he will know them. You know, he said, I have sheep that do not belong to this fold, you know.
They will know him when they die, or?
Yeah.
But
you know, people have asked me, how can God condemn billions of people in this world to hell who've never even had an opportunity to know Jesus? Well, first of all, I don't believe that God does that. I don't believe that God's that capricious and cruel. And secondly, that I think that Jesus is working in the world in ways that we aren't aware of. But as my systematic theology professor, Gwynye Muzarera from Zimbabwe, explained to me, as an African, he was thankful that the missionaries brought Christianity to Africa to give them a more perfect understanding of God and of Christ. Not that they were devoid of God or Christ before the missionaries, but what the missionaries brought was a complete understanding. No longer looking for God in the rocks or trees or animals or sky, but knowing who God really is. So everybody is seeking God in their own way. But what we have been given as Christians is a complete, perfect understanding of God and an absolutely ironclad, guaranteed way to get to God. And it's not through our becoming perfect saints. It's not through our good works, but it's through our trust in the one whom God sent to bring us home. This is all about God wanting to bring his children home.
Now, you found that out when you came. I'm going to ask you more questions about what you discussed, but you found that out, that to be true, when you came back to life and you were sitting with an old nun friend, Sister Dolores, and who obviously was a big believer in Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And you told her about
She
your
married
experience.
him.
Yeah. You
She
told
even
her
had a ring.
about your experience, and you were scared she wasn't going to believe you. And what were her words?
When I told her my experience, she just looked at me. And I said, "Sister, do you believe me?" Because I didn't, and, you know, she's giving this funny look, and she said, "Well, of course I believe you," but she said, "I've got one question." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "I wonder why it took so long." And I'm like, "What? What do you mean, what it took so long?" She said, "I've been praying for you for 13 years, ever since the day I met you and you told me you were an atheist. I've been praying for you every day. I have other sisters at the Notre Dame convent praying for you, and I don't know why it took 13 years. It should have happened sooner." I'll always love that.
So you think she prayed you into this then?
Oh,
She
absolutely, absolutely. If Sister Dolores hadn't been praying for me, I would have died June 1st, 1985. It was through her prayers that commended me to God. You know how, like, when someone's trying to get into college, you try and get them good recommendations?
Right.
You know, if you can get a good recommendation from, like, a senator or something, you know, like,
Right.
you know, they're going to get into the Naval Academy or into Harvard or something like that.
Right.
Well, that's when we pray for someone, it's like sending our recommendation to God. You say, you know, "Okay, God, I know this person's got a lot of problems, you know, and they're making some mistakes, but, you know, like, have mercy on them, be
Right.
good to them," you know.
And the irony was when she first came to the university and you had a talk with her, you said, "Look, sister, you can teach her, but I don't want you to preach."
Oh, no, she wasn't a
she was
teacher.
a
She was a
teacher?
student of mine.
A student,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
But I want you to preach.
Yeah, I said, "I want to hear any religion in my classroom." That was waving the red flag in front of Sister Dolores. Not stifling her. She had no intention of preaching in my classroom. It was my hostility to
Right.
her and her faith, which was quite conspicuous since she was wearing a full habit with a, you know,
Sure.
crucifix on it and everything.
You could stop her from preaching, but not praying. Thank
Yeah.
God for that,
Yeah.
right? All right, thank you. Appreciate it. Howard, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
Are we the only ones here? Is this the only planet with life on it?
Well, they told me that the universe was full of life, and that not only is there this physical universe, but there's other dimensions with other universes, and that God's sense of creating goes on and on and on, and it's just like lives and worlds and intelligent.
Higher intelligent beings than us.
Yeah, and that we
lower.
are not way up on the pecking order of intelligent beings. But this is a tough world we're in. This is a world where there's a lot of temptation, a lot of struggle, a lot of opposition to God.
What would you say to people who would say, well, where does it say in the Bible there are other people out there? There are other worlds out there.
It doesn't.
And they might argue then that part of your story is incorrect then. Because a lot of people believe that if it's not in the Bible, then it isn't.
Right. You know, early on people thought, like, in their city they were the only people on this earth and everybody else was, like, not even a human being. And then we got the idea that, like, our race was the only race and everybody else was somehow subhuman. And now we've realized that the earth does in fact orbit around the sun. And there's, I was just reading this morning, matter of fact, about they've discovered over 50 new planets already. This whole discovering planets in the universe is happening hot and fast right now. In time, people will realize that in this vast universe of trillions upon trillions of galaxies, each with full of solar systems, that God's creative ability is just vast. You know, when you think about God, look at, like, God didn't make, like, a maple tree. He made all different kinds of maple trees, and every maple tree is unique. You know, God didn't just make a kitty. Look at kitty cats. I mean, every cat is unique and wonderful, and God's creative nature and God's expression of God's love of the world is just without limit.
But you wrote in your book, and maybe you can explain this a little better for me than maybe how I understood it. Some people would read one of your passages that talked about the fact that if you didn't do things as you should have done here on this earth, and when you died, that maybe there was more that you had to do to better yourself, and that you might come back in some form or another. And they would look at it as reincarnation. Is that what you were talking about?
No, what I was trying to suggest is that I've met a lot of people who have lost children and things like that. they feel that somehow the people that have been lost have been shortchanged of a life experience. And all I was trying to suggest there was that God gives everybody ample life experience, whether we're aware of it or not. Do you know what I mean? So that we don't have to worry about people being robbed of an opportunity to live, because they will live somewhere, somehow, some way. And I don't know how, where, or way, but God does. You know, because this life that we're in is about spiritual formation. That's the whole point. We're here to be matured as spiritual beings. We're not physical beings dreaming about being spiritual. We're spiritual beings having a physical experience to learn compassion and love in a world with very, very finite, limited possibilities. And God will make sure that everybody has that opportunity. No one's going to, we can't stop it.
Let's talk about, though, the issue of the Jewish people. You saw a vision of the Holocaust. Talk about that, because even though people can't go to the Father unless they go through the Son, the Jewish people, by and large, have not accepted Jesus Christ as their Messiah. They're still waiting for him to come. But you saw something very different in your view of the Holocaust, did you not?
Yes. I've always been disturbed by the Holocaust. And I mean, I think every right-feeling person in the world would be disturbed. What was that all about? Why did God allow that to happen if they were God's chosen people? And we went to, see, I don't know how it works, but we were in a extermination camp. And the guards were kicking people and shouting at people, and there were dogs, and people were being selected, and there was a crematorium off in the distance. And I could understand, I don't speak German, but in the experience I could understand German, and the guards were saying in German, which I could understand, more for the angel makers, more for the angel makers. And Jesus, who had his arm around me, said, look up in the sky. And what I saw was, from the smoke of the crematorium, the people going up to heaven and the angels from heaven coming down and escorting them to heaven. And even more so was this, that these people who had just gone through hell, you know, through the horror of that camp and died, were now filled with ecstasy and joy.
You saw that on their faces as they were rising into heaven.
And so my understanding of the Bible is that the Jewish people are God's chosen people. The Lord and Savior of my life was a Jewish carpenter. I don't knock Jews. You know, there's one big difference between the Jewish faith and ours. We both believe in the Messiah, we believe in the same God, we believe in the same ethics, really. The big difference is that they think the Messiah is yet to come. We say the Messiah has come and will come again. I think it's, you know, not something to really fight about. I think we should treat Judaism with a great deal of respect.
But it doesn't also discount maybe each and every one of those individuals had a personal experience at the moment of death similar to yours, where Jesus came to them and gave them a choice. And we don't know whether that happened.
I would suggest that every Jew who dies is going to meet the Messiah. You know, everybody who dies will meet the Messiah, will meet the Christ.
And have an opportunity to accept or reject.
Right, because it's all about what's in your heart. Now, I'm not talking, of course, about the organ that pumps blood. I'm talking about the core of your being, which is what you really are. So a person could be a condemned murderer who's been executed for his crimes. But he could have reconciled himself with Christ, with God, received God's forgiveness, and go to God because God knows that in his heart there was goodness, even though he had done terrible, terrible things. Conversely, a person may think that they're just the most righteous, quote, religious person in the world. But if they've been ultimately cruel and created dissension and discouragement, I mean, every church has someone like that just goes around creating trouble. And it's like, you know, are you deliberately trying to destroy this church? You know, I mean, you know, and they're always the most self-righteous one, too. You know, these are always the people that are like, you know,
Sure.
pretend to be the most holy. They aren't going. They're going the other way because that's who they really are. The interesting thing about Jesus, there's no deception. There's no shadow. He knows us fully, exactly, perfectly, and you cannot lie in his presence. You can't hide. It's all out in the open. What's
And
inside you.
so it's not just about denying the existence of God. You may verbally deny the existence of God as you did, but when you're doing things that oppose God's will, when you're saying you love God but yet you're doing the opposite.
That's worse than denying God. You know, people who deny God's existence, having been one for a good part of my adult life, are people that are really angry at God. They're really disappointed. You know, so they're, in a sense, they're still in a relationship with God. They say, do you ever see a little kid go up to their parent and go, I hate you, mommy, I hate you, you're not my mommy anymore?
Right.
That's what people who claim to be atheists are. I hope that I don't upset anyone, but I submit to you that in their heart, they know there's a God, and in their heart, they want more than anything else in the whole universe is to know the love of God and to be accepted by God. That's what they want deep down inside of them, but they're mad, and so they're going around knocking over the furniture and jumping on the sofa and breaking the dishes, saying, because they've been traumatized. Sister Dolores, once again, she told me, she said, I said, why are there people like that? And she said, there's a trauma. Look for the trauma.
But your word to them would be?
I've got some AA groups down in the basement of my church, and they've taught me a lot about seeking God. And the leader of the AA group, Jim, tells me all the time, he says, you can't help anyone until they've hit the gutter. Now, it doesn't mean that literally. You don't have to be down in the gutter, but you got to hit that low before you say, God, I am helpless with my problems. I need you. I can't do it. I need you to do it for me. When you hit that point, that's the beginning of the love affair. And that's what AA teaches in terms of alcoholism, but I think it's true with all faith awakening. You got to hit that low before you can grow. Can I tell you a story?
Sure.
A man called me up from Texas, and his mother was having major heart surgery at one of the famous hospitals, one of the famous doctors down in Texas. And he said, someone told me about you, and I need you to come down here and help me through this, and I'll pay your airfare. And he was basically promised me a day in and a day out. I said, I really don't have the time. He said, well, just come for one day, come in the morning, leave in the evening. I said, okay, so I go down there. He was a gangster. I mean, this guy was like a really bad boy. And he wanted to hear about God and Jesus. His mother was a woman of faith. And here he was with his mother who was dying, and he couldn't cope with it and stuff like that. So I testified to him, and I loved him. And whenever he'd sort of tell me about his life, I'd like, oh, let's go back to something else now. I don't really need to know this stuff. And a few weeks later, he called me up and he said his mother had died, and he was with her when she died. And he said, the light of Jesus that you talked about? He said, she opened up her eyes, and I could see reflected in her eyes the light of Jesus coming for her. And he said, you know what you told me? He said, it's true, it's real, I saw it. So I mean, I don't know whatever happened to him, but I'm sure that had to have impacted him a little bit.
Saved a soul.
Yeah, I hope.
Which is the ultimate thing you can do in this world, huh?
Yeah. So, you take your chances, and you don't worry about the consequences of telling the truth, because the world spends so much time, and particularly our society spends so much time, planting the seeds of doubt and deception and falsehood. That if we go around and make a little bit of truth statement every once in a while, it's quite necessary to counteract all the deceit that's in this world.
Sure. And a big part of the deceit comes when people argue, okay, if there's this wonderful God, this being up there who's all good and all-knowing, why does he let so many bad things happen in this world? The Holocaust, for example, World War II, World War I.
I asked that exact question, and the response that they gave me was immediate and harsh. God hates those bad things. God never wanted those bad things to happen, and we are responsible for them. And they also told me that one of the things that God is very irritated about us, the human race, is that when anything's ever good, like we discover a vaccine for polio, we did it, rather than realizing that it was God's inspiration that helped us discover that. When anything bad happens, like a child is run over by a truck, or you have the Holocaust, or World War I, what was that about? Who knows? We go, why did God do that?
Or why didn't he stop it?
Yeah, we blame God for the evil that we do and give God no credit for all the good that God does. It's really perverse what we do. God only does good. God never does evil, but he will allow us to experience the consequences of our actions. As any good parent, one of the ways they try to explain it to me was
But what about innocent children, though? They talk about the poor, starving, innocent children, or children who are badly abused and brutalized and murdered. He could stop that because these innocent children had no choice in this.
God doesn't. He is trying to stop it. He is asking us to stop it. Every way, every day. He's telling us, don't do that. We know better, and we should care about those things. I mean, God is intervening. Will God take over this world and run it for us? No, because it would be a complete undermining of one of the most important gifts that God has given us. God has given us the ability to make a choice. People call it free will. I've shown you the ways of good and evil, of right and wrong. Now, do something about it. God's very disappointed with what we're doing. God hates those things more than we do.
You talked about the Cold War with him, and at the time it was 1985, and he said that the collapse of communism would come and things would end. And you said, no, that can't happen. That's not going to happen.
Well, it seemed so absurd in 1985, and I told him that the Cold War was going to go on for hundreds of years, and he said, no, it's going to end bloodlessly in a few years. It's just, I actually told them they were wrong. Couldn't happen. God is working in the world, but the way that God works is not doing big zaps with thunderbolts and lightning and stuff like that. God works by changing people's hearts. And God wants all of us to be working towards the same end.
And sending leaders out there. I know when the Berlin Wall fell and communism fell in different places across Russia and East Berlin, the Pope was given a great deal of credit because of his message of peace and love of God.
Right.
How did you feel when that happened? You had been told this in 1985, and here it happens.
It became,
89.
I was just like, yeah. Well, here's the bad part, because they told me some terrible things about this country, and I'm really concerned. Not for myself, because I'm 54 years old, so I'm like, hey, whenever heaven's ready for me, I'm ready to go. So.
What did they tell you? There's going to be another war?
That this country has been given an assignment to be a light to the nations. We are to be a moral leader to the world.
Because we have been given so much. We're so strong.
This country has been blessed more than any other people in the history of the world. Way more. We are the most powerful, richest people. All of this came from God. This is all a blessing from God. Our Heavenly Father gave us these gifts, and instead of being the moral leader of the world, we are the moral #1 manufacturers and distributors of war materials and pornography and a violent lifestyle. And I know people in America always hate to hear that, but if you go to any country in the world, and I know you've been around the world, their idea of what America represents, is shocking. Because what we export, the culture that we export, is so, it's demeaning to women, it's demeaning to human beings, it's demeaning to God, it's awful. And that's our #1 product in this society. Not what God intended, and God will take the blessing away. And we're going to be in one sorry shape.
What's going to happen? Did you see what would happen?
What could happen? Because what God wants is conversion of the heart. And so this wasn't like, this is going to happen. He said, without the conversion, this is what could happen. And that this society will just very rapidly fall back into a barbarism that's just inconceivable. People literally shooting other people over a can of condensed milk. you know,
So
can of
social
gasoline.
chaos would
So-
erupt.
Yeah, because of the our economic structure is all very complex and very fragile. You know, just begin to fall apart, and people in our society are so self-centered and greedy that they'll just start taking what they want. You know, and
So we will destroy ourselves from within. Well, a lot of people are assuming that there's going to be a third world war out there, a nuclear war.
No, I'm sorry. They told me, I asked about that, and they said absolutely there is not going to be a third world war. I was a product of post-war baby boom, so I've always been very concerned about hydrogen bombs and atomic bombs. When I was a kid, we learned to duck and tuck when I was at school. It was really pretty funny. But I asked them, I said, is there going to be another nuclear war? And they said, no, God's not going to allow that to happen. God will not allow another nuclear war.
Why? Did they tell you
Because
why?
because God loves this creation, the people, the birds, the rivers, the trees. And he's just not going to let us incinerate huge portions of it for our own silly gratification.
So there's the possibility of this social chaos erupting and just destroying ourselves. And then what will happen?
That out of that, God plans through God's inspiration to raise people up who will live in harmony and love and gentleness with one another and with the creation.
Describe that, because I was reading that to somebody and they said this sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel.
Yeah.
It's something they had never even heard of, never even conceived in their own minds.
Well, what they told me, I had never heard of or considered. If you had asked me before my experience, what would the future look like, I would have said Star Wars. High tech. You know, doors that go when you approach them, right? You don't have to touch them, they go and you could talk to the computer and the computer would talk back to you. That's what I thought the future was going to be.
Because that's where we're heading, we think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what they were saying was a world of incredible simplicity, living in great harmony with nature, even to the point of us living in harmony, in control of the weather and all the elements.
How? How so?
God created us to be stewards of this planet, caretakers of this planet. And we've done a poor job. And they told me that we have a lot of capacities that have never been released. Our relationship with the animal kingdom, vegetable kingdom, and with the whole planet, in time, as we become spiritually more sophisticated and wiser, we'll live in harmony with those systems, rather than seeing them as our enemy. Remember, when you were a kid, did you have to read Moby Dick? And the whole idea was nature was something to be dominated and killed because nature was like ultimately hostile to us. Completely wrong. We need to be going the other way with nature and learning to live more in harmony with it. And it will live in harmony with us.
And so you have, you described it as people living very modestly.
Yeah.
And basically they only had enough food to survive and only enough material
But
possessions.
they could grow food at will. So they didn't need, I mean, they had no anxiety. You know, I never thought of this before, it just occurred to me. They lived the way Jesus and his disciples lived.
Right.
You know,
And
that kind of
spoke
simplicity.
telepathically.
All over the whole world and the whole universe. They could talk to people, intelligent beings all over the whole universe.
And when
People didn't fear death because they knew that death was just a transition to moving on to a higher state. People lived, first of all, they lived to love and nurture and raise the children. Everybody's number one priority was the raising of children. And they made it, Jesus and the angels made it really clear to me that that's what we should be doing. We should make children our number one priority. Secondly, they lived to love and support one another in their intellectual pursuits, their artistic pursuits, their musical pursuits, whatever it is people were interested in. People lived to support one another in that. And people lived in harmony. They said when somebody got out of harmony with the rest of the community, the whole harmony, the whole community cared about that and was involved with trying to bring that person
And when they
back
got
in.
sick, they would pray them back to health.
There was they eliminated sickness because when someone got sick, they would just heal them.
Now this was in 1985, and you said that they said this would occur in 200 years.
Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty preposterous, but who am I to argue with God, you know? I mean, I told him, I said, it's ridiculous. I did. Well, after you're around Jesus for a while, you know one of the things you realize, you can say anything you want to. I mean, you don't say ugly things. but you say what's in your heart.
Sure.
And that's what he wants to hear from us. He doesn't want hypocrisy. He doesn't want formality. He doesn't want nonsense. He wants from your heart, from the core of your being. What do you really think? What do you really feel? He understands. He's been around. You know, there's nothing we can do to surprise Jesus.
So what happens after that then? How long does that life
I don't
last?
know. I don't know. That's not the second coming. That's just a better world, making the world more the kind of place that God created it to be. And I didn't inquire
Sort of
beyond
a
that.
heaven on earth?
Well, compared to the world the way it is today, it would be paradise, but
Right.
it's not, because people would be born and raised and have accidents and die. I mean, it's not eternity on earth. It would still be earth, and the same laws of physics would apply. We would just live in a much more sophisticated relationship with our environment, which means because our relationship with the environment was so much more sophisticated, it's actually much simpler.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you said the bad things that could happen, for example, to the United States, could happen, but through prayer, through conversion, that could end. And God has sent us guardian angels, or angels,
Right, millions
to
of them.
millions to help us. Let's talk about that. First of all, what do they look like?
Well, I've seen the guardian angels in many forms, and they can take different forms because, well, first of all, they can appear to be just like a regular person, and you don't know it. And I've had the experience, and I've met many people that had the experience of meeting someone, and they're like, wait a minute, that was impossible. That was an angel. That couldn't, you know, I mean, that it defied the laws of physics. They were here, and then they were, you know what I mean?
Right, right.
So angels can appear to be like people, but they also, I've seen angels in their full-blown glory, and the room is so bright, it's like you had 1,000,000 candle watts of electric power going on, and they're radiant and beautiful and
you've
full
painted
of
them,
color.
but you can't
Yeah,
even
it's a failure. I mean, I'm like such a...
but they
so
don't have
inadequate.
angel wings like the little cherubs we
Well,
looked
no,
at.
the wings actually, you know, it actually come from, in the Bible, it talks about that they radiate. And that has come to be translated as wings. But it's actually that they radiant appendages, and that's what they do. Angels give light. They are radiant beings, as opposed to you and I, who are opaque beings and absorb light. They give off light, but it's spiritual light.
And
They're beautiful.
And they're meant for us for what reason? For what purpose?
Well, first of all, they love us. They're emissaries from God, but they are very constrained about how much they would intervene in our lives. And they're in constant communication with God about how much or how little they can intervene, because it's the nature of an angel that they want to intervene all the time. But they know that that's not good for us, because if the angels gave us everything we always wanted, we would be a bunch of spoiled brats, and it would be absolutely no good at all. So they love us, they're with us, they take our concerns to God, they help us in subtle ways.
Protect
Like
us?
who hasn't had an example of you lose something, and you finally, after looking for it, you say, oh, God, send an angel and just help me find my checkbook. And all of a sudden, boom, right? There it was all along on the top of the desk, and you go like, how did I miss it? I mean, they do help us sometimes in lots of languages, but one of the ways that they help us is they're constantly trying to point us in the right direction, which is of love and compassion. And
But you said also in your book, I would like you to clarify this, you talked about how maybe even if we die, we can sort of become guardian angels for loved ones who are still back here. You don't mean transforming into an angel, it's sort of just, you used it as
they said that
metaphor.
some people that have like a real attachment can be around the people that they've left behind for a
because
while.
we've always been taught that a human being cannot become an angel.
Yeah, but we ultimately will be even greater than the angels.
Right. But what you mean
Ultimately.
is a protector
No,
like an angel.
when you talk about, I mean, this angel means several things. It can be any messenger of God. So I could be like an angel. I could say, I'm being an angel to you, you're an angel to me. But really, it's a class of beings who is created perfect and good and always does the perfect will of God. You know, they've never lived in this world. They've never, you know, gone through the struggle of making these choices between good and evil that we go through.
There have been many reported apparitions, visions of the Blessed Mother, of Jesus, of other saints, all across the world throughout history.
Right.
And some have been approved, for example, some have been approved by the Catholic Church if they've been to Catholic kids or
Yeah.
adults, and some have not. And a lot of people believe them and a lot of people don't believe them. What is your feeling about those
Well,
instances?
I mean, right now there's been a lot of things going. Ever since Medjugorje, there's been like a whole resurgence of visionaries in the United States, and even in Cincinnati we have a whole big thing going on of visionaries and stuff like that. I think it's good to try and use some spiritual discernment, and a simple test would be, is it consistent with the scripture, or are you hearing weird stuff? Like I heard of a visionary in Long Island, I believe it was, that said that Jesus wasn't the Christ and stuff like that. Well, that doesn't pass the smell test. You can, like, you know, walk away from that one. I mean, you know, when the minute a visionary says they don't like Jesus, you know, it's like, you know, they're out of it. Another thing is, what are they advocating? Like in Medjugorje, what I understand is that the vision is advocating conversion and prayer. So would that be of God or of the devil? Let me see. You know?
Right.
So you look at, is it consistent with the Bible and what the Bible teaches, and is it advocating good, or is it advocating harm? And that would be a good testament.
But you wrote in your book that God has sent throughout the ages emissaries of different sorts. It could be the Blessed, it could be anybody, to help bring us back to Jesus, to God.
Yep. Many of them, and even us, have been touched by them and didn't even know it. Like, how many of us, the faith that we have, we caught from like a grandmother, for example, or an aunt, or a Sunday school teacher? So you know what I mean? In a sense, God has inspired those people to be that special emissary to us. But God is working. I asked, why doesn't God do something really big and convince everybody and put it to rest? You know, and my idea was like sort of turn the sky orange, and then like in flaming letters, believe in God or else, or something like that, you know. And, I mean, who could dispute it, you know?
Right.
And they said, that's coercion. God doesn't do coercion. It's got to be free choice.
Because that's the tremendous gift he gave us.
Yeah.
That's why he loved us so much.
Yep. And that's what we're here to learn about. How do you exercise that choice? You know, and every minute of the day is an opportunity to make those choices.
But obviously, and people would argue, everything you need to know is within that Bible. As he said, everything to convert is in the Bible, but he gave you this experience. You're back, you're talking to people about it, which will probably save who knows how many souls out there through your
Well,
books.
I hope one at least.
And through maybe this program.
Yeah.
There have been other people with similar experiences to you. So just because it's not in the Bible doesn't mean God can't reach out and say, look, wake up. You're going down that slippery slope.
God is moving in powerful ways. They told me that this was a time of great spiritual awakening, because God does not want to punish us or condemn us. God wants conversion, to be the people of God that God created us to be. So God is moving in powerful ways. Near-death experiences is just one tiny little way that God is working, but there's all kinds of like things going on in terms of charismatic renewals in the churches and things like that. It's just endless. The way that God is stirring things up. But what's the reception to these things? Is it just the preaching to the choir, or are people actually being converted? That's the real issue.
Now, you were able to ask him countless questions, and of course everybody's going to read about it when they get your book, My Descent into Death by Howard Storm. You finished talking with Jesus and with the angels, and then they tell you what? It's time to go back?
Oh, it was very disappointing, because they said that I had to come back to this world. I said I wanted to go to heaven. They said, no, you got to come back to this world and live this stuff. And I said, I don't want to come back to this world. And we had a huge argument, because I said the world's full of cruelty and ugliness and awful people and evil, and why would you send me back to a world like that? And they said, well, you know, those things are there, but there's also goodness and loving people and kindness and beauty in the world, and whatever it is we seek, we will find. So if we seek beauty, we'll find beauty. If we seek loving people, that's the nice thing about going on the Christian walk. There's all the neat people you meet, you know.
Right.
But anyhow, we had this huge argument, and we talked about forgiveness and prayer and all these things, and ultimately, I thought I had something that would allow me to go to heaven. I said, you can't send me back to the world, because I will die of a broken heart if you do. Because now that I have known you in your love, speaking of Jesus and the angels, I could not bear to ever be away from you again. I absolutely meant this, and they knew I meant it. And they said, haven't you been paying attention? We've always been with you. We always will be with you. And I said, but I never saw you before. I never heard you. I never felt you. I mean, when I go back, it's going to be like that again, right? And I said, yeah. And I said, well, pretty soon, it'll be like you don't exist. And I won't know you. And I said, but there is a way to know us. And I said, how? And I said, that if I prayed, if I confessed my sins, which I like to think of as coming clean with God, you know, just laying your cards out on the table, you know, and prayed to God and left time to listen and feel God, which is like, be quiet, be still, you know, wait on the Lord. They said, sometimes you would know we're with you. And they've kept that promise. And so sometimes I feel their presence.
So
I've had some experiences too, but...
So you said, okay, then I think I can go back?
Yeah.
And then?
And with that, I was back, and to my horror, I was right back in that body that had been in such terrible shape.
Lying on a hospital bed. What
Yeah,
happened?
And, immediately upon me coming back, the nurse who had been in the room a little while earlier and said there was no doctor came back into the room and said, a doctor has arrived at the hospital, we're going to do the surgery right away. And they evicted my wife from the room, and they prepped me and did the surgery that I needed.
So they performed the surgery on you, and you're back in recovery, and you wake up. How do you deal with all this when you're back?
Well, it's a huge dilemma because I knew that what I had experienced was fantastic, to say the least. I mean, incredible. Meaning, who would believe me? Incredible. And when I tried to tell my wife and other people, it was incredible. They didn't believe me. They thought it was a delusion or hallucination or something like that. And for a while, that caused me to sort of withdraw from wanting to deal with people because it was, and I'd pray to God, like, if you gave me this experience and nobody wants it, then why did you give it to me? And why'd you give me the memory of it? Because I think a lot of people have these experiences, but they don't remember. I know several people that have had experiences, but they say, I can't quite remember it.
Yeah.
But I have a vivid memory in mind.
Vivid detail.
Yeah.
But you're laying in there, and you have this feeling, or hear this voice that says, get some airline tickets, you're going home over the weekend or Monday or whenever it was,
Yeah.
in a few days. And you didn't imagine that could be possible because you had just had a major operation.
Yeah, that was on Tuesday, and I'd had the surgery on Saturday night.
But your wife comes in, you tell her to go get the tickets, and...
Yeah, she goes, I mean, this is all so bizarre, people won't believe it, but it's the truth, absolutely. She walks out in the hall, goes to the payphone, calls collect her mommy and daddy in Iowa City, Iowa, and says, we're in trouble, I need a couple $1,000, we got to come home. They said, give us your phone number, we'll call you right back. They called their bank, their banker, and he said, what a coincidence, I just came back from Paris and we had an emergency and I had to wire money over there and I know how to do it. Tell her it'll be at such and such an address in 10 minutes. You know, if you ever try to get money in a foreign country, you know it's like weeks. I mean, it's impossible.
Right.
But this banker knew how to do it like now. My wife comes back into the room. She says, I've talked to my parents. They're sending the money. I'll be back in an hour. She leaves, comes back in about an hour with 2 TWA airline tickets to go back to the United States on Monday morning, which is what I told her to do. And I said, what in the world have you done? She said, you told me to get the tickets. And I said, yeah, but why did you do it? That's crazy. I'm sick. I'm going to be here for a month. You know, I can't go home. But I did get well enough to come back to the United States because I needed the attention of an American hospital.
But you had a guardian angel visit you in the hospital before you left.
Oh, yeah, actually several different ones. But the
One was came in the form of a young doctor.
that was the one that I was most fond of. He was in his early 20s, blonde, short hair, wearing white short sleeve scrub, white pants, white shoes, and a white belt. And we had a long conversation, but basically he told me that he was going to watch over me, but I might never see him again, which I thought was pretty weird. Like,
And when he walked into the room, it lit up. It was
Yeah.
bright.
Yeah.
And when he left,
The room went back to dark again. And when the nurse came into the room, I said, who was that doctor that was just here? And she says, there's not been anybody here. I said, you don't understand. There was a young man. I described him to her perfectly. She said, well, my desk is outside your door. No one has been in your room. I was like, all right, who was that then? You know, where did he come from? But I always felt that God gave me his presence to help me, because it's scary being really sick and trying to recuperate in a foreign country and stuff like that. And that did the trick. That gave me the confidence that I was going to be okay.
And you got back home and they told you should have been dead within 5 hours. And it was...
Yeah. And when I got back, when I came to the United States, I had extreme peritonitis, double pneumonia, collapsed lungs, and no liver function. And I was put on the critical list at St. Luke's Hospital in Fort Thomas. And I was on critical for 5 weeks. I was really sick, but I didn't...
And you thought you were going to die, though, didn't you?
Yeah, and I'm ashamed of this, but I wanted to die because I just wanted to go to heaven. I just wanted to be with Jesus. And I didn't have anything else in my mind except I wanted to go back to that. And if you knew him, you would understand, you know, why that's what I wanted to go back to. So I wasn't cooperating in my healing. I couldn't eat. I couldn't take anything. I was getting weaker and weaker and sicker and sicker. And I got to tell you the story. A night nurse by the name of Lisa came in one night, and she was about the only person in the hospital who had been listening to me talk about Jesus and his love and all this stuff. And this sweet little Lisa, real recent graduate of a AA program in nursing, got an associate's degree. She said, I'm going to make you a milkshake. I'm going to go down to oncology and make you a milkshake and get you well. And I said, I haven't eaten anything in weeks, you know, like, forget it, I'm not eating a milkshake. The idea makes me sick. And she said, we'll see. And she came back and she said, I put raw eggs in this, and I put protein supplement in it, and I made it with, like, the best ice cream in Cincinnati, and, like, real cream and stuff like this. This huge milkshake. And I said, Lisa, just the smell of it makes me nauseous. Get it out of my room. And she said, listen, I made this out of love, and you're going to get well now. And she stood there for over an hour while I sipped on that stupid thing and drank the whole thing. Now, she probably could have gotten fired from the hospital for doing this. But, I mean, she was absolutely inspired by God to do this, because there's no reason in the world why she would have done that for me, you know. And from that day on, I just started getting better.
And while you were laying in that hospital room, you also kept hearing a patient in another room wailing.
Oh, yeah.
That was a beautiful experience as well.
So sad. A man across the hall, whose name was Clarence, had extreme Alzheimer's, and all he did was make sounds like a wild animal, really loud though. He was also a biter, and every time a nurse, I'd see a nurse or something go into his room. A few minutes later, you know, like, Clarence, don't bite me. You know. He couldn't make any rational sounds, and his wife stayed in the room with him. And she was a sweet woman. I felt so sorry for her and for Clarence. And one night, he was driving me crazy. He would wake me up in the middle of the night with his howling and his screaming, and nobody could calm him down. And it was like a wild animal. And it's like, man, I'm sick. I'm trying to get well, and this guy's like making me sicker, you know, with his noise. And so I said to God, I said, what is this about? Why do I have to be, you know, in a hospital with this, like, crazy man, you know? And I was shown that what he was doing, Clarence was still Clarence, way deep down inside that diseased body. And he was just, Clarence was basically yelling, I'm still alive, I'm still here, I'm still me.
But he wasn't able to express it.
So it's just coming out in all these strange, contorted ways.
And then what did you do?
I started to pray for him, you know? And I thought that he and I became buddies after that, although I never saw him.
Didn't you yell out something, or Clarence, I know you're there, and it calmed him when he did that?
I yelled to him, and I said, Clarence, I'm hearing you now. I finally understand what you're saying.
And that calmed him?
Yep.
Somebody heard him?
Yep.
His cries
Nobody else heard him. Well, you couldn't hear him because it was just noise.
Now, eventually you're released from that hospital. And I have to also point out, there was no evidence on paper that you received that said you actually had died in that Paris hospital.
Right.
Because, did you ever ask for it, or they didn't know?
Oh,
There
yeah,
was nobody-
we had the American consulate, we had a U.S. senator, we had all kinds of people trying to get my medical records, and they would never send my medical
Oh,
records.
so you've never even gotten the records?
And I think I know why.
Because of what they didn't do.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. The lawsuits. You get out of the hospital, and eventually you recuperate, and you're back at the university?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you deal with that? You're back in this environment where you were in before, a very heady intellectual environment with your friends around, all non-believers, I assume.
Well, I wanted to show them Christian love, and they asked me to be the department chair. And so I became an administrator. And I did my best to take care of their needs and to love them and to get them the best raises I could possibly get and get them the equipment and the facilities and the materials that they were all hollering for all the time. But they were not interested in my message. And in fact, some of the administrators over me told me to never, ever mention my experience or God or heaven or Jesus or anything, ever,
They thought
ever.
you were loony. They thought you were making it up?
They despised it. They hated it.
You made them angry.
Yeah, I mean, I had people say to me, sidle up to me and says, you know, you don't really believe all that crap you've been saying. You know, you don't believe that, do you? You know, like, well, yeah. I mean, people, they don't want to accept it because if they were to accept it, then it would challenge the whole structure of their thinking. You know? So I felt more and more alienated from my colleagues, unfortunately, because it seemed, and I was also becoming more and more fascinated by the church, which the university is supposed to be a haven of light, but it was really the church that was the haven of light.
And which church at this point?
Well, I prayed, when I was recuperating from my illness, I prayed a lot to God, where would I go? And ultimately, I was talking to an artist on the telephone, and I was not ambulatory, and she said, well, I go to this church down the street, and I asked my wife, and it turned out it was what I had been raised in, and it was only a mile away. And so I went there, and I saw it full of the angels and full of funky people trying to be better people, and I said, boy, this is for me.
And you had a Catholic nun, a friend, a student, who had prayed you into this. You never considered Catholicism. You went back to something that you were familiar with, or you felt called back to?
I did consider Catholicism. I went on, actually I went on several retreats with the Jesuits, and they said, basically to me, you're doing fine where you are, why don't you just stay where you are? I did look at Catholicism and consulted priests, and they didn't discourage me. They said, but
Follow where God's taking you?
yeah, you're being very active in the church that you're in, doing the right thing. Why would you leave that and come do this? And I couldn't really explain that. I didn't feel called to do that.
So over the next 7 years, by 7 years later, you're a Protestant minister. You have a master's in divinity, and you decide to check all the university life and.
Yeah, that was hard because I'd worked so hard to become a tenured professor, and finally, as a tenured professor and as a chair, was in the gravy.
Sure.
It takes a while, but you know, I was doing real well. You know,
and your wife's an attorney. How does she feel about that?
Well, she thought I was absolutely out of my mind.
Yeah.
You know, she was saying, look, if you want to be like a minister, you can go get a church and do it on the weekend and keep your job. You know, nobody's stopping you. You can play minister if you want. And I said, no, I want my whole life to be about the church, about God's people. And she said, well, you're doing ministry at the university. And I said, yeah, I know, but I can't talk about Jesus, I can't talk about God. I mean, that's not what I had in mind. I want to give my life to the church. So I went to seminary for 3 years and became ordained, and I've been at this church for 9.5 years.
Right. Yeah. Do you feel like now that if God would review your life these last 9.5 years, the last year since 1985 even, that you would be a disappointment to him again?
No. I don't want to sound presumptuous. I haven't done a perfect job. I've made a lot of mistakes. There's a few things I'd be embarrassed about.
You're still making a few mistakes then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ain't no saint. But I feel like, see, all God asks of us, I know this absolutely, God asks just do our best. God's not saying be perfect, change the world, you know, just do your best. And God knows that I've done that. And so all I need to hear from Jesus is, well done, good and faithful servant. Mm-hmm. Not, you've been a success, not, wow, you know, you really had a big impact or anything. I was faithful and I did my best. That's all he wants from us.
What would you tell any of the intellectuals that might be listening and are closing their hearts to this message, or closing their minds to this message because they're not allowing their hearts to speak to them? How can they begin to grasp what you're saying? Because it's a very simple message, and sometimes people want the bells and whistles and something just enormous to happen.
Well, these, you know, intellectual people tend to live in the rational mind and not the experiential mind. But I would say that if you prayed to God the simplest possible prayer, said, God, you know, in the name of Jesus, I would like to experience you in my life. I would like to know you or know if you're real. And if they gave that a chance, in peace and quiet and sincerity, that God would not disappoint them. So I would challenge them, if they consider themselves to be of any intellectual integrity or not, try it and find out for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Because the danger, the truth of the danger out there, and that's what you experience, I think that's what's so powerful, is that the devil and the evil spirits are out there prowling the earth, as we've read in the Bible.
Like a roaring lion.
Like a roaring lion. And people don't like to believe that, don't like to talk about it, dismiss it as something that's only in horror movies.
One of the greatest success of the evil one is to convince us all that it's not real, and it's all a big game. And unfortunately, it's too real, and it's something that needs to be taken seriously. I don't like to, I like to fill myself up with the light of Christ, and that takes care of my problem with evil. Mm-hmm. But you bump into it every once in a while, you know, and you got to face the reality of it.
Even after you've accepted Christ.
Yeah.
But for those who haven't accepted him yet, they have to be aware that if they haven't accepted him, then they're being led by another force.
Absolutely. They don't even know how much he has power over them, you know.
It doesn't matter what you've done, God is always willing to take you back. Is that not true? You're like the prodigal son.
Right. It's the incredible thing is people, well, I'm too bad, I've done too many wicked things or stuff like that. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I have a man that I'm working with who's on death row in Ohio, and he did a really bad thing. You don't want to know about it. It was the worst thing you can imagine he did.
Heinous crime, yes.
And he has turned to God, and he's received God's forgiveness, and he lives in this horrible, constricted little life, death row, trying to be a witness to the other, there's 200 men on death row there, to the other men up there. And he has purpose and meaning in his life, although his life is really, really hard. And he'll never get out of there. And he admits his crime, and he doesn't want to get out. He doesn't seek a pardon or anything. He feels his punishment is justified. But the only way he'll ever get out of there is to die or be executed. But his name's Martin. Martin is right with God, and he knows it. Anybody can be right with God.
Was it your personal witness to Martin that helped him? Because we always are told that our personal witness...
It was a little piece, but we all have our own little role to play. You know, some of us, the Bible says, some of us till, some of us weed, some of us cultivate, some of us nurture. And we don't really need to claim the harvest. You know, just play our part. You know, you know what I mean? In terms of the conversion of the world. And it begins with how you treat the person at the cash register. You treat them like a thing because they feel like a thing. You know, if you've ever done service work with people, you know, and everybody treats you like you're just, you know, furniture. You bring a little joy and brightness into their life.
But it's not always easy, and sometimes maybe your family members won't accept your message readily.
No, yeah. The odds are really good that they're going to be the first problem you're going to face, and I have too. And what we need to do with our family I learned this the hard way. The difficult way is you got to pray and pray and pray for them and turn them over to God, because you're the least effective person in terms of converting them. You need to pray for them and love them, but don't try and convert your family. Let God convert your family. Be the right example. Always be willing. Always, But I mean, I told my kids, if you don't go to church, you're not going to get any money, and that doesn't work. Threats and fear don't make it. Only builds resentment.
So ultimately, you would tell people out there that God has a very special plan for each and every one of them, but in order to understand their plan, they need to pray for guidance from Him.
To pray it and to explore it. The way that we find what God wants us to do is with trial and error. God has given me certain gifts and abilities, and lots of limitations, lots of places where I'm not gifted and stuff. So I have to learn through trial and error where I should put my energy, put my compassion, put my concern, and other things. Don't get involved with it because I'm not good at it or it's not fruitful for me. You know what I mean? So we explore, but the main thing is this is the school of learning how to love, and it's all experiential learning.
But
it's not theoretical, it's experiential.
But it's a universal message for all people. I know when we were speaking on the phone about the Jesus Christ issue, and you said something to me, you said you didn't feel like you needed to ask about that specifically because you understood that if people love God, they love Jesus, and they might not even know they love Jesus because God is Jesus.
Yeah, there's no, there are three revelations of God. God, the Creator, Father, Christ, the Son, who lived as a person called Jesus of Nazareth for, 30-odd years. And the Holy Spirit, but it's three persona of the same being. And there's, in essence, no difference between any of them.
If you had to leave people with one thought, one message, something that they could hold on to, you've said so much already, obviously, but just something that you want to leave them with.
That it's very easy. That God loves you way more than you can possibly imagine. That's what I want people to know. How much, I can only say it, I can't, they have to find out for themselves, but they're very, very important to God, and God's love for them is just much greater than anything they could ever imagine.
Howard Storm's unforgettable account of his near-death experience has taught us many precious lessons, and that death need never be feared by anyone. And it's important to remember that God predestines no one to go to hell. It is our choice. I'm Mary Lou McCall. Thanks for joining me.